subscribe, click on the bell, like, comment.
Chapter 12 of Oscar Wilde and Myself by Lord Alfred Douglas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. My letters to Wilde. The law as to property in letters appears to be in a very confused and amazing condition. Letters, though lightly penned by most people and considered to be of trifling importance, are nearly always far more important than they look. If I had been cautious and worldly wise, I suppose that the letters which I wrote to Oscar Wilde, or at any rate those which were produced by favour of Ross at the Ransome trial, would never have been written. The fact that they were written, however, cannot be denied, and for many reasons I am not sorry that they were brought up against me. I knew that some such letters existed, and I was told before the trial came on that they would be produced and that they would ruin me. Well, to the great consternation and amazement of the parties immediately concerned, I went into the witness box and faced the music, and I was not ruined. By a coincidence, it happened that I had various difficulties of litigation round about the time of the Ransome trial, and rumour had it that those troubles were in some way bound up with the Wilde affair. As a fact, they had nothing to do with it, and were quite independent of it, and even the endeavour to create a public impression that my wife had left me because of the Ransome trial proved utterly futile. The unfortunate differences between myself and Lady Alfred Douglas arose out of matters of settlements and the education of our child, and, lest my enemies should lay the flattering unction to their souls that they have succeeded in separating us, I may mention here and now that my wife and I are no longer at variance, and that our reconciliation was brought about by our two selves, after the trial, and not before it. In the witness box I made no bones about condemning the two letters of mine which were raked up to show that I had a bad influence over Wilde's mind. I shall not attempt to justify them here, and I shall not abate my opinion of them one jot or tittle. They are letters which I am ashamed to have written, and which I ought to have a good deal too much sense to write. They have not been printed in the press, and I shall not reproduce them here, any more than I would think of reproducing similar letters written by Wilde and his friends. I do not think, however, that any man of the world who perused them could fail to recognize that they were letters written, more or less, in a jocular spirit, and that they were plainly not the letters of the kind of person some people have been gracious enough to wish to make me out. At school, the universities, and even in clubs, men who are not considered by any means wicked men make jokes, exchange jokes, and tell stories which, one takes it, would very much shock Mr. Justice Darling if they happened to come to his polite ears. There are persons of the highest positions in all walks of life, not even forgetting the immaculate and stainless profession of the law, who, in their day and generation, could swap coarse jokes with any stable boy, and who, over their wine, are not above indulging in a trifle of witty obscenity even yet. Everybody knows this, and nobody pretends that it is otherwise, or that it is ever likely to be otherwise. The only place where you get such a pretence is in the law courts, when counsel wishes to eviscerate somebody. The pretence was well kept up at the Ransome trial by all parties concerned, and, as I have said before, I do not in the least complain, but am rather glad than otherwise. For the improper is obviously the improper wherever you encounter it, and there is no reason why my impropriety should be extenuated while the next man's is punished. I punished myself for my offences against decency and good taste by standing up and having them read out to me 20 years after they were written. I could have run away from them if I'd wished to, but I stood my ground and took my gruel with a short spoon. The result has been exactly what one was entitled to expect that it would be. I have not lost a single friend, or come across a single cold shoulder as the result of Mr. Ross's letter-preserving charitableness. My cousin, the late Right Honourable George Wyndham, MP, than whom no more honourably minded man existed, wrote to me immediately after the trial, and told me that he had followed it closely, and that nothing had happened which was to make any difference between himself and myself, and he added that, not only in his opinion but in the opinion of many persons with whom he had talked, I had been abominably treated. Of course, it is preposterous to say that my influence over Wilde was a bad influence. If the letters produced to prove it prove anything at all, they prove, rather, that Wilde's influence over me was a bad one, and a very bad one at that. Anyone who knows me must be well aware that, when it comes to the question of his ultimate vices, such influence as I had over him was on the side of goodness and decency rather than otherwise. In all his cunning, overweening, and merciless desire to damage and destroy me, Wilde could never find it in his heart to set down the last unthinkable lie. He knew that if he did, that he would be blankly sinning against the Holy Ghost, and hate me as he would, and rage as he would, he could not bring himself to take the terrible risks. Nowhere in all this outpouring of hate does he dare to come out with the accusation which would put me outside the pale of social possibility. That he was quite willing to have shouted that accusation out at the top of his voice if there had been the slightest ground for it is only too evident from the general drift of what he has to say. If, by a deft ambiguity, he can get in the hint that will hurt me without going the length of the rankest perjury, he gets it in. It is plain on every showing that our friendship was a harmless and proper friendship, and that our life together was harmlessly, if perhaps somewhat extravagantly, lived. And two things have always to be remembered. First, that during our friendship, whether despite me or otherwise, Wilde did undoubtedly produce the best of his plays and the finest of his poems, indeed the only poem which is likely to live. While, during the same friendship, I, for my part, produced the bulk of the poetry contained in The City of the Soul. There is nothing in any of the work produced by Wilde during the time that we were together of which he need be ashamed, and there is nothing in The City of the Soul in which I need be ashamed. On the contrary, Wilde's reputation, in so far as it is a pure literary reputation, has been largely built up on the work to which I refer, whereas it is largely by my own work during that period that I shall stand or fall so far as posterity is concerned. How dare people assail and defame an association of this kind? I print below 2 letters which were sent to me by Mr. George Wyndham immediately after the Ransome trial. I leave the parties concerned to make the best they can of an outside opinion, and to meditate with what gratification they may on their base thing. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Oscar Wilde and Myself by Lord Alfred Douglas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. My letters to Labouchere. That the late Henry Labouchere was a good deal of a blackguard is well known, but he was one of those blackguards who managed to get into the House of Commons, and, as impudence was a gift with him, he made some reputation there. When Gladstone proposed to give him a cabinet appointment, however, Queen Victoria calmly drew her pen through his name. Gladstone gasped, but Labouchere did not become a minister of the Crown. Labby's strength lay in his money. A poorer rogue would not have been tolerated, even in the House of Commons. and Labby's weakness was truth, the paper, not the abstraction. Labouchere always made a great point of running truth in the interests of public morality. For quack doctors, begging letter writers, and certain classes of bookmakers and moneylenders, he had, invariably, abundant stripes. But for the very big fish, Henry Labouchere had a confirmed respect, and was most careful to say nothing about them and do nothing to them, unless they happened to fall, when he would rush in and deliver a few kicks. It is not astonishing that as soon as Oscar Wilde came to grief, Henry Labouchere should have hastened to put in his bit of kicking. While Wilde was flaunting himself about town and going strong, Labby found it convenient to let him alone, even though there were rumours. And truth was nothing if not an investigator of rumours. In his heyday, therefore, Labby would say no word that was evil of Wilde, though he poked fun at him. But the moment Mr. Justice Wills hands out 2 years' hard labour, and Wilde is down and past mortal chance of getting up again, forth comes Labby, with his silly little patent leather boots, and his dirty little dagger, and Wilde is kicked and stabbed without mercy. Incidentally, too, Labby took the opportunity to refer to me as a young scoundrel, and to accuse me of deserting my friend in his trouble. I wrote and pointed out that, so far from deserting Wilde, I was the one and only friend of his who remained faithful to him after his arrest, and visited him daily in prison and when he was up at Bow Street police station. And I went on to express my opinion of the mean and unnecessary venom of Labby's attacks on a man who was down and unable to defend himself. It is characteristic of Labouchere that, while he was too much of a coward to print my letters in full, and was content to publish only that part of one of them in which I defended myself against his charge of deserting my friend, he was careful to preserve them. 18 years after they were written, truth turned up in court with them, to be used against me in a manner with which truth was not in any way concerned. I presume that they were produced under subpoena, though how their existence became known to Mr. Ransome remains a mystery. With that fine sense of what is fitting which distinguishes him, Mr. Justice Darling explained that the people who have kept and produced my letters are not to be blamed, inasmuch, said his lordship, as they are only doing what they're paid to do, which is somewhat cryptic, but is possibly meant to be funny. However, I do not care twopence who treasures these letters of mine. The only point is that somehow it seems un-English and unsportsmanlike. As for the letters themselves, they failed entirely in the object to which they were put by Ransome's lawyers. I cannot find that it was thought wise to print extracts from them in the newspapers at the time of the trial, and, as I have not got possession of them, and am apparently not entitled to possession of them, I cannot print them here, even if I were disposed to do so. I know what is in them, however, and there is no reason why I should not summarize them. The letters contain the stock arguments of those apologists for the perversion to which Wilde was addicted, which were current at the time. They point out that vice of this character was rampant in the West End of London, and at certain public schools and universities, and that Labby had not said a word about it in his wonderful paper, Truth. The letters also quote, or epitomize, sundry medical and scientific views on the subject. That is all. What I had to say I said plainly and without beating about the bush, and while I should not write such letters today, there is nothing about them which is greatly to my discredit. During the whole time of the trial, there sat in court the author of the following statement. It is a matter of common observation among physiologists that where a child is born to a couple in which the woman has the much stronger nature, and a great mental superiority over the father, the chances are that the child will develop at certain critical periods in his career an extraordinary attraction towards persons of its own sex. This fact is one of nature's mysteries. Those who believe in a divine creation of the world should reverently bow their heads before what they cannot understand, and ought to take to be a divine dispensation. At any rate, the wisdom of nature may be presumed greater than that of the ecclesiastical courts. There is nothing in my letters to Labouchere which can in the least compare with the foregoing passage, which I take from The Life of Oscar Wilde, by Robert Harborough Sherard. Sherard's life, like Ransome's critical study, is published broadcast and under everybody's nose, and both of them, as we have seen, contain their individual views of Wilde's vices. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Oscar Wilde and Myself by Lord Alfred Douglas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The article in the Revue Blanche. In pursuance of what I conceived to be my duty towards Wilde at the time he was in prison, I wrote the Labouchere letters and a good deal of similar matter which was not printed. My argument was not that Wilde had wrongfully been convicted, and not that what he did was to be counted to his credit, or even to be approved, but merely that there were scientific and medical grounds for supposing that he was not responsible for his actions in this regard, and that, in any case, the punishment meted out to him seemed unnecessarily and brutally severe. I do not know that I have changed my opinion to this day. It is unthinkable that a sane person could flounder into the loathsome depths in which Wilde was taken red-handed. Particularly, it is unthinkable in respect of a man of Wilde's culture and social surroundings. That he was sane enough in other regards cannot be doubted, but I do not think there can be any question as to his insanity on this particular point. But this is as far as I go, and this is as far as any decently minded person can go. I never went an inch further, and never intended to. I have already stated that after sentence was passed upon Wilde, all Paris appeared to go off its head with regard to the scandal. Many absurd and unfounded pieces of gossip were published in the French newspapers, and some of these I took it upon myself to endeavour to refute. When it became known that I was in Paris, the interviewers flocked round me and wanted me to talk to them on all manner of silly matters. I declined to have anything to do with them in a general way, especially as I found that they were disposed to garble and exaggerate everything one might tell them. One fine morning, however, there called upon me a journalist with whom I had some acquaintance, who told me that he had been commissioned by the editor of the Revue Blanche to get me to write an article on the Wilde affair in which my views should be set out definitely and finally, and thus put an end to the extraordinary stories which were being circulated in my name. I knew the Revue Blanche as a weekly literary journal of somewhat advanced opinions, and I thought that here was an excellent opportunity to say something that might be of use to Wilde. My difficulty was that, while I spoke French fluently, I did not feel that I had a sufficient command of style and so forth to write the article in French. My friend the journalist was very accommodating, however, and it was arranged between us that, with the knowledge of the editor of the Revue Blanche, I was to write an article in English, which would be translated into French and inserted in the paper over my name. I wrote the article and handed it to the representative of the Review for translation and publication. I stipulated for a proof in French, but the next I heard about the matter was that the article had appeared. The translator, whoever he was, simply took my article as a sort of peg, and hung on it a farrago of extremely vicious opinions, and even more vicious comparisons, which I had never put forward, and which my own article certainly did not suggest. I complained to the editor of the review at the time, but found myself unable to obtain any redress, and there was nothing more to be done. The French article passed almost unnoticed, inasmuch as the Revue Blanche had a very limited circulation, and I never heard another word about it until years after, when I was editing the Academy. In that paper I had occasion to write a paragraph about a journal called The Free Thinker, which was edited by a Mr. Foote, and which made a sort of business of blasphemy. Mr. Foote was not pleased at what I said about him, and, by way of retort, he translated a particularly nauseous passage from the Revue Blanche article, inserted it in his journal, and accused me of being the author. I immediately issued a writ for libel against the proprietors of the Free Thinker, and, after receiving the writ, Mr. Foote discovered that he had made a serious mistake, and promptly apologized in the next issue of his paper. He did not even enter an appearance. I was content with my apology, and allowed the action to lapse. This is the whole truth about the Revue Blanche article. Though the review is now dead, the proprietor and editor are, I believe, still alive. If, as was contended in the Ransome trial, I wrote the article I am said to have written, or furnished the material for it, these gentlemen could easily have been produced to say so. But they were not brought forward as witnesses, and were not even approached on the subject. Yet the article was put in at the trial, and though I said on oath in court what I now say here in print, and my assertion was not in the slightest degree shaken by cross-examination, Mr. Justice Darling persisted in reading aloud, and for the benefit of the jury, words which I had not written, and this in spite of my explanations and protest. There is no use in complaining, nor do I complain. I merely put it on record once for all that the Revue Blanche article is not my article, and I am in no way responsible for it. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Oscar Wilde and Myself by Lord Alfred Douglas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 15 years of persecution. I do not think it is an exaggeration to say that from the day of Oscar Wilde's sentence in 1887 down to the Ransome trial in 1913, not a single week has passed over my head without some unpleasantness or other arising in consequence of my friendship with Oscar Wilde. Even before Wilde was sent to prison, the trouble began. There was talk and gossip almost from the commencement of our acquaintanceship. This was largely set afoot by envious people. Wilde's friends could not brook that we should be so constantly together, and that I should, to use their own phrase, monopolize him. In point of fact, I had no desire to monopolize him. It was simply impossible to shake him off. If I left him for a day, he would seek me out, and want to know where I'd been, and why I had not asked him to accompany me. If I went abroad, he would follow me, and either entreat me to return, or sit down solemnly and wait my time. So continually were we together, that our friendship became matter for public comment, and was referred to in the newspapers. I do not say that I disliked all this, though it was certainly embarrassing and even annoying at times. In a sense, perhaps, I was rather flattered. I have always been fond of companionship, and Wilde was undoubtedly an entertaining companion when he liked. Besides which, he was famous, in a way, and it is not always unpleasant to go about with famous people, particularly when they happen to be very civil to one. It is a fact that Wilde could not bear me out of his sight. If we happened to be staying together and I went away for 10 minutes without telling him where I was going, he would work himself up into a state of nervous apprehension, and rouse a whole hotel with his inquiries. I remember that when we were at a hotel in Algiers, I went out to make a purchase without mentioning to Wilde that I was going. On my return, half an hour later, I was met in the hall by a scared-looking concierge, who said, "Monsieur, you are back! Votre papa has been demanding to know where you were, with great noise, for the last hour." Wilde happened to be descending the staircase at this precise moment, and overheard what the man had said. The expression "votre papa" simply drove him to fury. He was always vain of his youthful appearance, though as a matter of fact he looked much older than his age, and he jumped to the conclusion that he was beginning to look old. He could not see that his anxious queries as to my whereabouts had set the hotel people thinking that he must stand in a parental relationship to the object of his solicitude. For myself, I was vastly amused, and, for months after, if I wished to make Wilde fearfully angry, I had only to say, "Votre papa." I may perhaps explain here that from the very beginning I always treated Wilde in the way I would treat any other friend of mine. That is to say, though I believed him to be a great man, I never had any awe of him, and I never flattered him. Not only so, but at times I made a great deal of fun of him, and there were occasions when he didn't relish it. For example, he had been talking to me and to other people at great length about Milton. Somebody in a paper had pointed out that certain of his sonnets had a Miltonic echo about them. He admitted that this was so, but said that what the critic called an echo was really an achievement, and that he had wilfully set himself to write sonnets like Milton's, which should be as good as Milton's. For several days his conversation turned in the same direction, and in the end I began to grow a little weary of the Milton-Wilde amalgamation, and told him that it was quite easy to write Miltonic sonnets, and that lots of people could do it besides Oscar Wilde. On leaving him that evening, I wrote and posted to him the following sonnet, which, I need hardly say, was writ sarcastic. Oscar, what though no brazen trumpet call of fame hath called thee to the foremost van of life's array, though not from man to man thy name is bandied, though thy life seem small, ignoble in men's eyes, the Lord of all, who reads the heart and with his fearful fan purges his flaw, knows thy true talisman, a humble soul too near the ground to fall. Therefore repine not if thy lot obscure seeks quiet ways and walks not with the crowd. A kindly heart is more than laurel crown. A virtuous life builds thrones that will endure more surely than the kingdoms of the proud, and thrift shall stand when luxury falls down. Wilde professed to take this undergraduate effusion seriously, and pronounced it to be not bad for an amateur, but we heard no more about Miltonic sonnets. I mention these things, which are typical, so that the reader may be spared the conclusion that my friendship with Wilde was a smooth and treacly affair, for it was nothing of the kind. Indeed, we had many a tiff and many a disagreement, and I wrote no end of skits and letters to him, some of them not over civil, and that he remembered them, and that they hurt him much more keenly than I had intended, is shown by his references to loathsome and brutal letters received from me. Anything that displeased Wilde was loathsome, brutal, callous, coarse, and so forth. If I wrote and said, "My dear Oscar, I am afraid that I shall not be able to come round to lunch today, as I am feeling a bit off colour," I could count on getting a reply in such terms as, "I have received your careless note. If you are ill, surely you can say so without using coarse and vulgar expressions." I took precious little notice of these missives, and when we met the next day, neither of us would refer to them. As I have said, people gossiped about our friendship and exhibited a certain amount of jealousy of me, but I was not then, and never have been, disposed to allow third parties to interfere in my friendships. I have shown what happened when my own father attempted to make differences between us. The moment Wilde was sentenced, things were made intolerable for me. Lying tales as to my indifference to his fate reached Wilde, and he was told that I was about to publish letters of his to his damage and my own monetary profit. The only letters of Wilde's I ever proposed to publish, in my life, were letters which contained sentiments that were to his credit, and even these I withdrew the moment I heard that he was supposed not to wish them printed. Not only was every effort made to embitter and estrange Wilde against me while he was in prison, but I was being continually assailed by impudent rogues, who professed to have information and documents which it would be worth my while to buy. To these people I paid neither the smallest heed nor the smallest of moneys. They never had a farthing from me, nor will they ever get one. I was threatened with exposure by pretty well all the crawling vermin of London and Paris for months after the trial. I knew there was nothing to expose, so that I was not particularly anxious, but seeing, as I had seen, what venom and villainy were capable of doing when they got fairly to work, I do not profess that these threats were pleasant reading of a morning at breakfast. Furthermore, my family were assailed in much the same way, and, though they never allowed themselves to be victimized, they were not entirely delighted with the constant current of menace which came their way. In 1902 I married. It was a runaway match, which neither myself nor my wife have ever repented. At once, however, the dastardly attentions of the blackmailers, letter-sellers, and information-mongers were directed to Lady Alfred. We lived abroad for a considerable time, and, though the threats had been bad enough while we were away, they assumed a double fury when we came to England. They have continued with greater or less frequency ever since. The people who wanted money to keep quiet have fallen off unappeased long ago, but the kind and gentle souls who imagined that Lady Alfred Douglas would be pleased to hear something dreadful about her husband on an anonymous postcard are still with us, and crop up from time to time as the spirit moves them. When I took over the editorship of the Academy in 1907, the fun became fast and furious. We could not review a book adversely in the paper without being made the object of anonymous threats and abuse with reference to Wilde, and what was going to be done to us if we didn't look out. Persons on papers at Oxford and Cambridge wrote paragraphs about the editor of the Academy containing veiled suggestions as to the discreditable character of his former relations with Wilde, till we were compelled to take legal proceedings. Then they fell on their knees and wept bitterly, and spoke of their dying fathers, and apologized humbly and paid our costs. I sent my friend Crossland down to see the dons of one of our universities who were responsible for a certain publication, and he sat solemnly with these learned and reverend signors in the cloistered seclusion of College, while they solemnly settled the terms of an apology and tried to make the costs pounds instead of guineas by promising to dismiss their editor. From time to time, too, outsiders took a hand at the game. It was through the tender offices of these people that I had steady reminders of the existence of mysterious letters which were being held by one of them, and which were to be produced for my destruction when this gentleman might deem the occasion to have arisen. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Oscar Wilde and Myself by Lord Alfred Douglas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Wilde's poetry. Wilde once said to me when we were discussing poetry that there were two ways of disliking poetry, one being to dislike it, and the other to like Pope. This remark was brought forth really by Aubrey Beardsley, who was present, and who said that for him, at any rate, there was only one English poet, namely Pope. It is highly characteristic of Wilde, who, although he insisted on his own eminence as a poet and a critic of poetry, never committed himself to what might be considered a serious theory on the subject. Piecing together the views he expressed from time to time in a casual and general way, I am convinced, indeed, that he had no theory which was in the least stable or cogent, and which was not liable to be altered by the moment's whim or mood. It is certain that, while he hankered after poetic distinction, and in his early manhood strove after it, his aim was not so much to produce great poetry as to turn out stuff which would provoke the critics to write about him, and the witlings to talk about him. He published a volume of poems when he was 26 years of age, but after that he produced next to nothing poetical till he wrote the Ballad of Reading Gaol. The Sphinx, it is true, was published in 1894, but it had been written many years before. In his preface to Wilde's selected poems, Mr. Ross tells us that Wilde's early work was never, until recently, well received by the critics. He adds, however, that they have survived the test of 9 editions, with the 9 in capital letters. For myself, I do not admit that the poems have been well received by criticism, even recently, for the very simple reason that there is very little in them to receive. Of course, it is unfair to apply the test of reception to any poetry that is worth talking about, just as it is unfair to rely on the test of editions. To take an instance in point, there is Miss Ella Wheeler Wilcox, who has been received with all manner of plaudits by all manner of reviewers, and whose works have stood the test of probably 90 editions. But who in his senses is going to tell us that this estimable lady is a great poetess, and to be mentioned in the same breath as, say, Mrs. Browning or Mrs. Meynell, the latter of whom, at any rate, has not achieved even so many editions as Wilde? It is plain that the only real test of poetry is its quality, and neither its reception nor its saleability can affect that quality. If we apply such a test to Wilde's early poetical work, which represents the bulk of what he accomplished, we shall not find that he shines with anything like the effulgence that his adherents have imagined for him. Wilde himself knew that he was not a great poet. His cry is continually, "I am an artist, the supreme artist, in fact," and never, "I am a poet," or "I am the supreme poet." He knew perfectly well that that cock wouldn't fight. He was not even anxious to be known as a poet in the way that some of his contemporaries were anxious to be known. He told me that to be dubbed poet was to raise up visions of untidy hair, dirty linen, and no dinner to speak of, and such a view of himself he abhorred. Never be a poet, my dear Bosie. Be a gentleman, a connoisseur, an artist, what you will, but not a poet. Let us leave being a poet to Dowson and Arthur Symonds, and, if you like, Dick Le Gallienne. All Wilde's biographers have striven manfully, and, one might say, pitifully, to make a great poet out of Oscar Wilde, and they have failed. Even Mr. Ransome, the most zealous of the bunch, cannot bring himself to any more flattering conclusion than that Wilde was a sort of inspired plagiarist or imitator who, in Mr. Ransome's view, improved upon what he appropriated. Nobody who has read any poetry other than Wilde's can fail to perceive that, leaving out the Ballad of Reading Gaol, and, up to a point, the Sphinx, Wilde's poetical work consists of clever, and occasionally perhaps brilliant, imitations. Wherever one turns in the 300 pages of his published poems, one finds echoes, and little else but echoes. His sonnets are, for the most part, Miltonic in their effects. The metre and method of in memoriam are used in the greater number of his lyrics, and he used the metre which Tennyson sealed to himself for all time even in the Sphinx, which is his great set work. While in such pieces as Charmides, Panthea, Humanitad, and The Burden of Itys, he borrows the grave pipe of Matthew Arnold and what he himself called the silver-keyed flute of Keats. Haphazard, I take up the Ross-edited volume Poems by Oscar Wilde, and I open, on page 222, La Mer. A white mist drifts across the shrouds. A wild moon in this wintry sky gleams like an angry lion's eye out of a mane of tawny clouds. The muffled steersman at the wheel is but a shadow in the gloom, and in the throbbing engine-room leap the long rods of polished steel. The shattered storm has left its trace upon this huge and heaving dome, for the thin threads of yellow foam float on the waves like ravelled lace. The bird is Wilde, the plumage and call are Tennyson's to a fault. Then again, on page 136, to outer senses there is peace, a dreamy peace on either hand, deep silence in the shadowy land, deep silence where the shadows cease. Save for a cry that echoes shrill from some lone bird disconsolate, a corncrake calling to its mate, the answer from the misty hill. And suddenly the moon withdraws her sickle from the lightning skies, and to her sombre cavern flies, wrapped in a veil of yellow gauze. More Tennyson, with the in memoriam verse lines arbitrarily and wrongfully disposed for the deception of the innocent. I might go on quoting from Wilde in the metre ad nauseam, and never strike so much as 4 lines which can be pronounced to be pure Wilde. With the Sphinx as a whole I shall deal later, but I may point out here that while Wilde arranges the stanzas as though they consisted of 2 lines, they really consist of Tennyson's 4, and, for correctness' sake, should have been printed thus. In a dim corner of my room, far longer than my fancy thinks, a beautiful and silent Sphinx has watched me through the shifting gloom. Inviolate and immobile, she does not rise, she does not stir, for silver moons are naught to her, and naught to her the suns that reel. Tennyson's suns, as well as Tennyson's stanza. I am not suggesting that all this is otherwise than neat and deft and skilful and pleasing, but a poet of parts, leaving out the true poet so beloved of Mr. Ross, should surely have a note or tone or cadence of his own, and not warble so distressingly like the true poet in the next street. As the Wilde faction appear to be acquainted with no poetry but poor dear Oscar's, I will take a few passages from In Memoriam, which, while they will be familiar to the more intelligent reader, will doubtless come in the way of an eye-opener to people like Mr. Ross. Let us repeat, to begin with, The second verse of La Mer. The muffled steersman at the wheel is but a shadow in the gloom, and in the throbbing engine room leaps the long rods of polished steel. This is, as we have seen, Wilde. Against it, let us put Tennyson's I hear the noise about the keel, I hear the bell struck in the night, I see the cabin window bright, I see the sailor at the wheel. If ever there was an impudent and unblushing crib, surely we have it here. I wonder what the Ransomes, Sherards, Harrises, and Inglebys of this little world would say if they caught anybody else but Wilde at pretty little tricks of this kind. In Wilde, such childish conveyance must be excused and even held up to admiration. In another it would be sheer theft. Then again, take the second set of stanzas I have quoted from Wilde about peace and silence, and compare them with the following from In Memoriam. Calm is the morn, without a sound, calm as to suit a calmer grief, and only through the faded leaf the chestnut pattering to the ground. Calm and deep peace on this high wold, and on these dews that drench the furze, and all the silvery gossamers that twinkle into green and gold. Calm and still light on yon great plain that sweeps with all its autumn bowers, and crowded farms and lessening towers to mingle with the bounding main. Calm and deep peace in this wide air, these leaves that redden to the fall, and in my heart, if calm at all, if any calm, a calm despair. Wilde's verses are plainly a paraphrase, and a bad one to boot. It will be urged that he wrote these in his youth, and that all poets, more or less, echo one another when they're young. But when one comes to consider that out of the 40 or so lyrical pieces which Wilde wrote, no fewer than 18 are in the metre of In Memoriam, and not one of them is free from images, phrases, or cadences which can easily be paralleled out of Tennyson, while the whole of the Sphinx is open to criticism on the same grounds, one cannot doubt that Oscar Wilde is a poet who has rather overdone the youthful imitation business, and one can scarcely be expected to break the alabaster box of critical adulation at his feet. I have not space to enter into great detail with regard to those lyrics of Wilde which are not flatly Tennysonian. There are about 20 of them, and they include a cheap imitation of La Belle Dame sans Merci, a flagrant copy of Hood's lines beginning "Take her up tenderly," and sundry pieces which are childishly reminiscent of Mrs. Browning, William Morris, and even Jean Ingelow. Of his own initiative, Mr. Ross heads up this collection of poetical brummagem with such taking titles as Eleutheria, Windflowers, Flowers of Gold, The Fourth Movement, and Flowers of Love. But the fact that they are wood pulp or serraceous replicas of other people's nosegays is of no account to the faithful and the blind. As regards the sonnets, which may perhaps be said to constitute that part of Wilde's poetical work which is best worth consideration, I have only to say that while it would be tedious to compare them side by side with the sonnets of Milton and other writers, such a comparison cannot fail to convince any reasonable being that in this department again Wilde was an over-sedulous ape. So over-sedulous, in fact, that he is careful to emphasize and exaggerate the very faults and defects of his masters. On the point of technique, the importance of which cannot be too gravely insisted upon where the sonnet form is concerned, he is continuously and hopelessly at fault. His rhyme sounds are, for the most part, of the cheapest and the most hackneyed. Of the 28 sonnets which he produced, 7 have rhymes to play, say, day, and so forth. Rhymes to see, be, and me are common, and in even greater number, and on no fewer than 21 distinct occasions are we proffered such rhymes as liberty, anarchy, memory, democracy, already, victory, luxury, and the like, or an average of 3 times in every 4 sonnets. And this, if you please, is the work of the supreme artist. It follows without saying that while Wilde believed himself to be writing in the Italian sonnet form, he persistently finds himself unable to adhere to the difficult rules of that form. He has octaves with 4 rhymes in them instead of 2, and he will wind up a sextet with a couplet like the veriest tyro of them all. The contents of the sonnets represent the best of Wilde's thought, being, for the most part, free from fleshliness, cynicism, and perversity. Yet, when one has said this for it, one has said all. There is nowhere anything very great or very noble or very beautiful, and one never catches even a suggestion of the large accent which makes a poet. Sententiousness, grandioseness, and a laboured classicism set forward with the help of an artificial rhetoric which at times is almost comic, are the upshot of Wilde's sonnets taken generally and in the lump. There now remains the set pieces such as A Garden of Eros, à la Matthew Arnold, The New Helen, à la Keats, The Burden of Itys, à la Matthew Arnold again, Panthea, a blend of Matthew Arnold and Keats, and Humanitad, more Arnold, also The Sphinx and The Ballad of Reading Gaol. No lover of poetry in a high sense is likely to waste much time in the perusal of the 5 pieces first mentioned. It is not claimed for them by anybody that they are other than cold and super-painted failures, produced in the spirit of "Now let me show you what I, the scholar and a connoisseur, can do," rather than by any spiritual or poetical impulsion. Only the meagrest portions of them can be admired, even by the elect, and these portions are not edifying. As for the Sphinx, even if we concede that the uneasy effect of its metre be dismissed from the question, we have left what is, on the face of it, a work of not always too successful virtuosity on a theme which is frankly bestial. There is an undoubted pomp and swing about some of the stanzas. There are pictures well visualized and put on the canvas with a fine eye for colour, and the element of curiousness or weirdness is well sustained. But right through the piece, one is made to feel that it is not the poet, but the mechanician who has come before us, and continually he creaks and whirs, as it were, for want of oil and control. Wilde, doubtless, set out to build a jewelled palace for his dubious, and, if you come to look at it closely, loathsome fancy. He has succeeded only in establishing a sort of Wardour Street receptacle for old, tarnished, and too vividly coloured lots. His efforts to do things in the most dazzling and wizardly manner are at times ludicrous, and his endeavours to get up unthinkable passions provoke one to laughter rather than awe. In a despairing determination to tie to the end of the poem something on which a reasonable being might ponder, he becomes utterly inconsequential. False Sphinx, by reedy Styx, old Charon, leaning on his oar, waits for my coin. Go thou before, and leave me to my crucifix, whose pallid burden, sick with pain, watches the world with wearied eyes, and weeps for every soul that dies, and weeps for every soul in vain. The dragging in of this bit of specious religiosity as a bonne bouche after an orgy of flamboyant passion-slaking is, doubtless, very cunning and clever, but it has nothing to do with either great art on the one hand or common sense on the other. The Sphinx is a poem which may well have stirred certain resorts in the neighbourhood of Piccadilly Circus to their foundations. It is a poem for the perverse and the curious, but its value as art or poetry is next door to negligible. I have already said that in my view the Ballad of Reading Gaol is the only poem of Wilde's which is likely to endure. It is as different from his previous work as chalk is different from cheese, and to read it after perusal of the Sphinx or the Sonnets, it might almost be the work of another hand. In point of fact, it was indeed written by a Wilde who had very little in common, whether intellectually or artistically, with the Wilde of the bulk of the poems. Up to the time of his imprisonment, Oscar Wilde, poet, had encouraged, or pretended to encourage, certain very grave fallacies with regard to poetry. He asserted, largely I think because he knew himself to be incapable of sincerity, that poetry was, in its essence, a matter of pretence and artifice. He held that style was everything, and feeling nothing. That poetry should be removed as well from material actuality as from the actuality of the spirit, and that no great poet had ever in his greatest moments been other than insincere. He professed other odd views, and used roundly to assert that he would rather have written Swinburne's Poems and Ballads than anything else in literature, and that Shakespeare was not, after all, a very great poet. I remember that when some idiot talked of starting an anti-Shakespeare society, on the ground that Shakespeare never wrote a line of poetry in his life, Wilde was vastly tickled by the idea, and said that Shakespeare had been much overrated. He would have it that Webster's Duchess of Malfi was a much better play and much better poetry than any of Shakespeare's, and, as he admired little that he did not sooner or later try to imitate, it is possible that we owe his Duchess of Padua to this view. In any case, up to the time of his going to prison, there can be no question that Wilde was peculiar and in a great measure heretical in his notions about what poetry should be. His opinions may or may not have altered while he was in prison. I never heard him renounce them, but after he came out he did arrive at a perception of the fact that a poet who wishes to be heard must make his appeal to the human heart as well as to the intellect, and that perversity is never by any chance poetry. And so he set about the Ballad of Reading Gaol. Even here, however, he could not walk alone. He must have models, and his actual model was the dream of Eugene Aram, with the Ancient Mariner thrown in on technical grounds. The result, of course, far outdistances Eugene Aram, just as in certain ultimate qualities it falls far short of the Ancient Mariner. It is sufficient for us that in the Ballad of Reading Gaol we have a sustained poem of sublimated actuality, and of a breadth and sweep and poignancy such as had never before been attained in this line. The emotional appeal is, on the whole, quite legitimate, and if we accept a very few passages in which the old Adam Wilde crops out, the established tradition as to what is fitting and comely in a poem of this nature is not outraged or transgressed. Because of this, and the general skill and deftness of its workmanship, the poem will last, and, though I cannot agree with those critics who desire to place Wilde among the immortals, I am certainly of opinion that it is on the Ballad of Reading Gaol, and on the Ballad of Reading Gaol alone, that his reputation among posterity will stand. The placing of poets and poetry in their proper relation to the mass of literature is no fool's job, and I am aware that the opinion of one age is frequently stultified by the opinion of the next. But this is not true of great work. I think it can be established that all great work has been admired and treasured from the beginning. From time to time, too, the vast quantities of mediocre and insignificant work is also admired, but in the nature of things there is no vitality about it, and, despite the paean of fools, it perishes. Much that Wilde has strung into verse will so perish. The ballad may persist, and save him from the oblivion which he seems to me assiduously to have courted. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Oscar Wilde and Myself by Lord Alfred Douglas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Plays and Prose Works. I have demonstrated in the foregoing chapter the absolute folly of Wilde's claim to supremacy as an artist. It is a claim which would never have been put forward for him if he had not put it forward for himself, but it is a claim which his adherents have constantly reiterated since his death, with nobody to gainsay them. And so vociferous and persistent have these people been, that the idea of Wilde's supreme artistry has come to be accepted without question by a gaping public, and to pass current as good, sound, critical coin, even among the cultivated. Wilde the supreme artist, in the capacity of poet, does not exist, and never has existed. We have now to turn to Wilde the supreme prose man. The Ross Ransome faction are nothing if not wonderful in this regard. Their one cry, which they repeat with parrot-like iteration, and to which they cling as a drowning critic might cling to critical straws, is this, Wilde's own saying: "The fact of a man being a poisoner is nothing against his prose." Now, this is such a truism that, of itself, it is not worth talking about. But it has been put up for the defence and glorification of Wilde in and out of season. Even our great literary judge, Mr. Justice Darling, takes his cue from this remark, and tells 12 English jurymen that because a man was a bad man, that is not to say that we are to refrain from reading his books, and so on. But all these people miss the real point, which is that, though the fact of a man being a poisoner is nothing against his prose, it is equally, and just as clearly, nothing for it. Without going further into the question at the moment, I shall venture to deal with Wilde's prose writings on the assumption that if they are no worse, they are certainly no better through the fact of the shamefulness of his life. Wilde himself never made any great fuss about his prose writings other than the plays. He regarded, and very properly regarded, the essays in Intentions, together with the fairy tales and his other stories, excepting of course the picture of Dorian Gray, as so much donkey work, and pretty well on the level with his lectures, which were written for the pure purpose of getting money, and with no eye to supreme artistry. Intentions was first published in 1891. 3 years went by before the book passed into its second edition. The first edition was published at 7 shillings 6 pence, and I believe I'm right in saying that the second edition, published at 3 shillings 6 pence, was simply a remainder of the first, in a cheaper binding. It was not till after Wilde's imprisonment and death, and after the boosters had been at work on him for some years, that we began to hear of the marvellous artistry and genius which this volume is alleged to exhibit. Wilde himself would have laughed in his sleeve if he could have been told that such preposterous claims would ever be made for his pot-boiling fleers and ironies. He knew that the decay of lying, the critic as artist, and the truth of masks were, in a large measure, cribbed from Whistler. And he knew that Pen, Pencil, and Poison was the merest review article, and neither better nor worse than the average stodginess which the public of his day accepted from their somnolent monthlies. The doctrine in these papers will not bear examination. When it is good, it is not Wilde's, and when it is bad, it is horrid, and not necessarily Wilde's at that. It is studded with such claptrap statements as, "All art is immoral," "Society often forgives the criminal, it never forgives the dreamer," "There is no sin except stupidity," "The Greeks had no art critics," "It is difficult not to be unjust to what one loves." His crimes gave strong personality to his style. "I am prepared to prove anything." The more we study art, the less we care for nature. Shakespeare is too fond of going directly to life and borrowing life's natural utterance. Meredith is a prose Browning, and so is Browning. I live in terror of not being misunderstood. To have a capacity for a passion and not to realize it is to make oneself incomplete and limited. And so we might continue to the complete exasperation of reason and decency. Pernicious and scurrilous stuff was always in Wilde's bosom, and if he could get it off in a sly way while pretending to discuss serious matters in a serious sense, he was delighted. His doctrine was nothing more or less than a doctrine of smart negation. That he had literary skill enough, and wit and scholarship enough to be entertaining, nobody wishes to deny. But the cultivated people whom he entertains place no value upon his opinions. It is the middling-minded who are not entertained and yet take him for gospel and allow such intellectuality as they may possess to be damaged and warped by his insincerities. On the whole, therefore, I say that intentions will not do if we are to consider Wilde in the light of a serious and illuminating thinker. On the ground of artistry, style, and so forth, the book is not by any means flawless. That Wilde had a good, easy prose style, and did, at times, write accomplished prose, I admit. But in this regard he stands on no better level than Mr. Frank Harris or Mr. Gilbert Chesterton. All three of them, Wilde, Harris, and Chesterton, are killed by the exuberance of their own facility. They have the pen of the ready writer, and they fall accordingly. Moreover, Wilde is prone to the over-sugared and over-gilded passage, even though he can be as bold as the boldest, and as limping as the lamest. Of his minor defects I will say nothing, except that his split infinitives are a standing disgrace to him. We may now pass to his stories. I have always held that if Wilde was anything at all, he was an inventor of stories. Such social success as he ever attained was almost entirely due to this gift, coupled with a remarkable delivery and a good voice. "I have thought of a story," was an announcement forever on his lips, and his intimates knew that 5 times out of 6 the story would be worth listening to. When I first knew him, his pet stories were of the order of the inverted fable, somewhat in the manner of the fables of Ambrose Bierce. 2 examples, which have never been published, I may set down here. One of them is what Wilde called "The True Story of Androcles and the Lion." He said that though Androcles may have been an early Christian slave, he was also a dentist. A certain lion found himself suffering from severe toothache, and consulted Androcles on the subject. The dentist advised gold filling for the back teeth, and an entirely new set of teeth for the upper jaw or mandible. Later, Androcles, because he was a good Christian, was thrown to the lions, or rather to a lion, and perceiving when the beast was let loose upon him that here was an old friend, approached him with joy, feeling sure that the lion would not hurt him inasmuch as he had made no charge for the gold filling and the upper set of teeth. But the king of beasts had other views, and promptly tore Androcles to pieces, and chewed him up with the very teeth which had been so kindly and generously supplied to him. And the other story was called Presence of Mind. In a theatre in America, said Wilde, there was a young flute player who was gifted with an extraordinary presence of mind. One evening some of the scenery caught fire, and, as the smoke and flames began to rush into the building, the audience prepared to flee. Whereupon, with singular presence of mind, the young flute player jumped out of his seat, and, holding up a lily-white hand, cried in stentorian tones, "There is no danger!" In consequence of these words, the audience kept their seats, and every single soul of them was burnt to death. Thus we may see, added Wilde, how useful a thing presence of mind really is. Of course, he had other stories in different veins, and I believe that all the tales in The Happy Prince and The House of Pomegranates, as well as in the volume which contains Lord Arthur Savile's Crime, were told by Wilde over and over again before they were written, just as he told the tale of La Sainte Courtisane and the plots of his plays before they were written. The Happy Prince and The House of Pomegranates are not without their merits as fairy tales, in the manner of Hans Andersen, but Wilde could not be content with the simplicities of his model, and some of the stories are marred by the obliquities of the cynic and the perverse mind. Lord Arthur Savile's Crime, and the stories printed with it, may be said to represent Wilde's attempt to come up with Robert Louis Stevenson on the plane of the New Arabian Nights. For my own part, I do not think that any of them quite comes off. Wilde's friends have been at great pains to dilate on their exquisite charm, their mordant humour, and so forth, but they have always seemed to me to be fairly feeble. Lord Arthur Savile's Crime itself is so over-fantastical that it becomes farcical. The Canterville Ghost, which Wilde describes as a hylo-idealistic romance, is a feeble but unblushing imitation of a now forgotten story called Cecilia de Noël by Lane Falconer. The Sphinx Without a Secret is a very stale and flat disappointment, and The Model Millionaire is exactly the kind of story for which Titbits or Answers gives a guinea prize every week. I should not like the reader to imagine that I am dismissing these things airily, or pooh-poohing them for the mere sake of doing it. I have lately read them with care, and I marvel that anybody can pretend that there is a great or dazzling merit about them. I believe that at the bottom of his heart, Wilde felt that his true genius had found expression in his plays. Being the man he was, he could not refrain from praising his own poetry, his own essays and stories, and professing that they were very fine things indeed. But when he talked of himself as a supreme artist, it was the plays that he always had looming in his mind. For his poetry, he had never received any of the critical rewards which would have so delighted him. He was never hailed poet by the poets contemporary with him, never admitted to that higher hierarchy to which Tennyson, Swinburne, Arnold, Browning, and, if you like, even Rossetti felt and knew themselves to belong. But his general prose, and some of his essays, paid for lavishly by Frank Harris when he was editing The Fortnightly, made a 9 days sensation. But they brought him no real credit or reputation. Neither did the storybooks. It was with Lady Windermere's Fan that he first got home, as it were, with results which, in the way of finance and applause, were entirely beyond his wildest dreams or expectation. Lady Windermere's Fan was a success, as successes went in those days, and it was followed by other successes, culminating in The Importance of Being Earnest, which brought Wilde more money and more appreciation than any of them. Because the plays were a success, and London went to see them, Wilde allowed himself to think that they must be important as literature, and that he was a great dramatist. Sir Arthur Pinero will probably not consider himself too flattered when I mention that Wilde had the greatest possible admiration for his work, and told me that from Pinero and Dumas Fils he had learnt all he knew of stagecraft, and that he considered The Magistrate to be the best of all modern comedies. It is certain that for the plays, as for everything else he did, Wilde had to model himself on somebody, and Sir Arthur is fortunate or unfortunate in having been the man. One has only to compare the constructive methods of the two to recognise this. The only difference between them is that Sir Arthur Pinero maintains an illusion of strict sanity among his characters, whereas Wilde is not always to be depended upon in this regard. Besides which, there is the further difference that while Pinero conforms to the established code of morals, and makes his good people good, and his bad people bad, Wilde has a tendency to hold up bad people for good people, and drops out really good people altogether. I'm going to say this much, and no more about the plays as a body. Namely, that they put Wilde into a secondary position with regard to Pinero and Mr. Sidney Grundy. His plays are not literary or intellectual plays, but just the conventional things which were stirring in London during Wilde's period, with the Wilde paradox, irony, flippancy and insincerity thrown in. I am no frantic believer in the supreme gifts of Mr. George Bernard Shaw, and I have never been able to get up any great enthusiasm for the sentimentalities of Sir J. M. Barrie. But it is quite certain that both these gentlemen have beaten Wilde as exponents of a drama which is supposed to be concerned with art and literature rather than with the stage and the box office. Wilde will not last as a dramatist, whether behind the footlights or in the closet. His plays have been revived occasionally, and the glitter has been found in a great measure to have died out of them. While, as plays for reading, they would not be read at all if they bore any other name but Wilde's. I will ask any unbiased person to peruse Lady Windermere's Fan, or, if you like, An Ideal Husband and The Importance of Being Earnest, and tell me if here is a great work. I do not wish to load these pages with quotations from books which are readily obtainable, but if I were so disposed I could set forth twaddling and mock-heroic dialogue and feeble humour from Wilde's plays by the yard. There are passages in all the plays which might have been written by a sentimental schoolgirl rather than by an artist, or by a giggling actor rather than a wit. I shall not say that the plays failed of their purpose, which, however, could have been at best only a temporary purpose. A man who boasted of the intellectual superiorities of which Wilde boasted demeaned himself when he wrote them, and still more hopelessly demeaned himself when he pretended to take the popular applause which followed for honest fame. I was constantly with him, as I have shown, when he wrote the most successful of them. In a careless way, I aided and abetted him in their production, but it never entered my mind that they were either fine drama or fine literature. and whatever Wilde himself might have thought about them, he certainly would not have contended that they were wonderful works or genius before me. I do not wish to suggest that a man of genius is not entitled to condescend to the demands of the popular stage in certain circumstances, such as need of money, or a desire to show that genius can do common things quite as capably as common people. And it is therefore that I do not blame Wilde for writing the prose plays. But it is obviously illogical and idiotic of him to turn round and profess that because he could tickle the popular fancy of his period, the work with which he did it is as fine and as worthy as anything in dramatic literature. Nobody knew better than he how false and foolish and how subversive of reason such an assumption must be. Wilde's boomsters have gone further in this stupid business than even Wilde himself would have gone. If we are to believe what they write, Wilde is the greatest dramatist since Shakespeare, and beats Goldsmith, Congreve, Sheridan, and all the rest of them into a cocked hat. The cold truth is that he never succeeded in rivaling Sir Arthur Pinero or Mr. Jones, and that he has been outdistanced by his own pupil, Mr. George Bernard Shaw. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18. For Posterity. There is a critical shibboleth to the effect that no man can rightly judge his contemporaries. The true inwardness of this very comforting idea lies in its extreme utility where persons of mediocre intellect are concerned. Persons who write feeble poetry and silly plays, not to mention offensive fiction, always pretend to put their hopes in posterity. My contention is that posterity is not likely to be much more imbecile than the contemporary world, and that the foolish hopes of vain and incompetent people are consequently ill-founded. A feeble poem is not to be strengthened by the mere process of time, any more than a piece of strong work is likely to be weakened or degraded. It is singular to note, too, that people seldom appeal to posterity when they're being applauded. For a man with bouquets in his hand and the laurel on his brow, posterity does not exist. On the other hand, for all of us, whoever we may be, posterity has its use, and though I do not think that these uses are important to us, they nevertheless exist. By way, therefore, of a sporting offer, as it were, I shall reach a hand through time and ask posterity to do me a favour, which is this. When I have been dead 50 years, let some critic of parts put on one side Wilde's published work, the present work and my own poems and verses, and let him put on the other side all the biographies of Wilde he can lay his hand on, together with the parts of De Profundis which are now lying in the British Museum. And when he has examined carefully and critically these two bundles of material, let him say without fear or favour who has drawn the true picture, Lord Alfred Douglas, or Messrs. Ross, Ransome, Sherard, and Harris. I shall sink or swim on some such decision, and I am content. At the present moment, it is to the interest of everybody directly concerned that the Wilde myth should continue to exist. It is excellent for Wilde's publishers, excellent for the printing, paper, and bookbinding trades, and excellent for those critics and editors who are best known by their labours in connection with Wilde. For them it is merely a matter of trade, and innocent enough. It is also excellent for those depraved persons who take Wilde as their moral guide, and who profess to believe, and possibly do believe, that the viciousness for which Wilde suffered imprisonment is a species of superior virtue, and it is also excellent for that vast multitude of persons who, while they may have no particular sympathy with Wilde's depravities, are nevertheless of oblique mind and cynically immoral intellect. In the aggregate, these people are very strong, much stronger than the easy-going, uncorrupted masses of humanity imagine. They are so strong in England, and so numerous, that it is profitable to flood the country with Wilde's works at a shilling. They are so strong in the press that it is next door to impossible to find a critical review or newspaper wherein Wilde's name is not mentioned, from time to time, with bated breath and whispered humbleness. They are so strong socially that the Wilde evangelists are welcomed in the highest political and social circles. And they are so insidious that they have succeeded in upsetting the usually calm judgment of the bench and the bar. We have seen Mr. F. E. Smith, K.C., weeping crocodile tears over Wilde's memory, and expressing the hope that his sins were forgotten, and that his genius might be left to blaze brilliantly in all men's sight, without so much as a rude air to disturb it. There are two interests, however, which these bands of champions habitually ignore. One is the interest of letters, and the other is the interest of the public morals. It is not in the interest of letters that any writer, however capable, should be given honour and adulation beyond his merits. When Wilde is set up for the supreme artist, all other artists in all time are degraded thereby. When Wilde is set up for a poet of the first order, all other poets suffer damage by comparison. And when Wilde is set up for a moralist, there is just a lunatic, anarchist end of morals. The question of the public interest is largely bound up in these things, but outside of them there are ever graver matters. I maintain that even if we dismiss Wilde's private shamefulness from the account, he is still to be condemned by reason of the nature and intention of his writings. As I shall show in the chapter on Dorian Gray, Wilde himself admitted that Dorian Gray was a poisonous book. In its own way, The Sphinx is just as poisonous, and so are many passages in the essays which go to make up Intentions. In the plays we find him continually flying in the face of the rules of conduct which make life possible and keep it sweet. He preaches always, flatly or by innuendo, that vice is at least more interesting than virtue, that insincerity is better and more to be desired than truth, that cynical carelessness and indifference are more comely than kind feeling and altruism, and that the whole end and aim of life is to eat delicately, sleep softly, and be as wicked and depraved as you like, provided that you are wicked and depraved in a graceful manner. I find myself utterly incapable of acquiescing in such a scandalous view of the reasons and purposes of human existence, and I say my say accordingly. It would have been easier and more profitable for me to have made a book about Wilde which would not have appeared harsh or severe or in any way offensive to the factions which ring him round. The breaking up of other people's gods, even though they happen to be gods of clay, is not a job for a man of a pacific turn of mind. Wilde knew that some day a true biographical and critical account of himself would have to be written, and, doubtless, on the principle of getting one's blow in first, he put it on record that it is always Judas who is the biographer. The late lamented Charles Peace was of the same opinion, and so, doubtless, were many other unpleasant and somewhat exploded persons, accounts of whose lives have still to be written. It is conceivable that there are circumstances in which honest biography is of slight consequence. In point of fact, all biography that matters is largely a sort of exegesis, and commentary on the life work of its subject. The biographies of persons who have done nothing are, in the nature of things, unprofitable. Wilde made a stir in the world, and his drum-beaters and fugle-men have made an even greater stir on his behalf. It is right and proper that while the noise is still in the air, we should endeavour to discover its real meaning, and to get sight of the instruments by which it is produced. End of Chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Oscar Wilde and Myself by Lord Alfred Douglas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The British Museum and De Profundis. I have already shown that it was not until the Ransome trial was well on the way that I had any idea of the existence of the unpublished parts of De Profundis, or that the whole manuscript had originally been couched in the form of a letter to me. As soon as I heard rumours of these facts, I communicated with Mr. Robert Ross, and was informed definitely of them by Messrs. Lewis and Lewis, who, in their letter to me, asserted that I must have known of the existence of the manuscript, and that my name was omitted from the published parts out of consideration for my feelings. It is perfectly obvious that there is nothing in the published parts of De Profundis to which I could take exception, nor should I have been in the least degree injured if Mr. Ross had let it be known that the published parts were addressed to me, instead of leaving it to be inferred that they had been addressed to him. It is true that when I had a conversation with him prior to the publication of the book, Ross told me that there were certain references in it which I might not have liked, but he also told me that these had been expunged, and I understood that the book was really a letter addressed to himself. This is as far as my information went up to the time of the action. Before the trial I obtained, by order of the court, discovery of the unpublished part of De Profundis. I handed the document to Mr. T.W.H. Crossland, who, after perusing it, insisted on reading it to me from the first word to the last. I gave him answers then and there on every point he chose to raise, and I don't mind admitting that his examination of me was a good deal closer and a good deal keener than that of Mr. Campbell, K.C., who cross-examined me on behalf of Ransome. It was not until we got into court that we knew that Mr. Ross had been so kind as to hand over the unpublished parts of the De Profundis manuscript to the authorities of the British Museum, as a present to the nation, with the condition that they were to remain under seal till 1960, and that the British Museum authorities had been gracious enough to accept the gift. It is not for me to profess to know upon what principle the British Museum accepts gifts of secret documents. One takes it that somebody at the British Museum must have taken the trouble to read the manuscript before it was accepted and sealed up, and that unless the person who perused it was a sheer idiot, he must have perceived that it contained much scurrilous and libellous matter, not only concerning myself, but concerning the Dowager Marchioness of Queensberry and other members of my family. Yet the manuscript was accepted, and is now in possession and control of the officials at the British Museum. With these facts before us, we are brought face to face with an entirely new and unprecedented range of possibilities. I flatter myself that when I die, any lengthy manuscript of mine which I might care to write would have some slight value for persons concerned in the collection of holographs and similar material for museums. It is open to me, therefore, to sit down and write a villainous attack upon any eminent person with whom I may chance to be acquainted, and to arrange that my executor shall present it to the British Museum to be treasured for the nation, and put to such uses as the British Museum may at any time deem to be fitting. How many manuscripts of this nature may already be lurking on the British Museum's shelves, the wise authorities alone know. 50 years hence, we may wake up to a due knowledge of the real characters of most of our most noted public men, written by other eminent public men who have had real or imaginary grievances against them. It may well be that we shall have the pleasure of reading Mr. Lloyd George's inside opinions of Lord Reading and his brethren, written in Mr. Lloyd George's own hand, at the National Liberal Club, in moments of irritation or depression after the Marconi affair. Possibly Mr. Keir Hardie may have consigned to the same safe and honourable keeping some of his extraordinary opinions about certain dukes and certain judges. And to come into other fields, Mr. Clement K. Shorter may have lodged his private and innermost view of the character and habits of Sir William Robertson Nicoll, Mr. Thomas Hardy, Miss Marie Corelli, and Heaven and the British Museum alone know whom else besides. And what a chance is herein opened up for Mr. Frank Harris! He has known and apparently loved Carlyle, Huxley, Meredith, Matthew Arnold, and Oscar Wilde, not to mention Lord Randolph Churchill, Mr. Asquith, Mr. Ben Tillett, and other notabilities. He has nothing to do but to write what he likes about them and present the result to the British Museum, for opening and publication in that Annus Mirabilis 1960. Of course, it is ridiculous to suppose that any of the persons I have mentioned possess spleen and impudence enough to degrade themselves by doing anything of the kind. But the fact remains that the British Museum authorities are sitting at the receipt of custom, with open and itching palms, and that in Wilde's case they have received, and not only so, but have refused to disgorge when they were caught at it. I quite admit that, having once accepted on behalf of the nation a relic of any kind, the British Museum is bound to be cautious about parting with it again. This, doubtless, is the refuge behind which the authorities take their stand. But the real point is whether they were ever justified in accepting it at all, and whether, in any case, it was in the public interest that such a manuscript should be accepted. In law, the paper on which any letter is written belongs to the person to whom it is addressed. The De Profundis manuscript is addressed to me, on the face of it, and I hold that I have a moral, if not a legal right, to its possession. But leaving this aspect of the question on one side, the British Museum authorities will surely not contend that it is to the interest of anybody in the world, other than those persons who delight in scandal, backbiting, and malice, that such a manuscript should be preserved. What possible motive that is worthy can be offered as an excuse by these people? Argue as they will, they must perceive that the manuscript is one which in no conceivable circumstances can be considered to reflect anything but discredit on its author. When it is published, and it will be out of copyright one day, Oscar Wilde is finished. No reputation, however securely founded, can hope to survive the moral debacle which this manuscript demonstrates to have taken place in the mind of Oscar Wilde. It is said there must be honour even among thieves. A man may do despicable things and still retain a share of the respect of his fellow men. Murderers have gone to their doom and have yet compelled some sort of respect from the world in the manner of their doing it. As the published reports of the Ransome trial show, Wilde has whined and shuffled and protested and wept, and tried to shift his responsibilities to innocent shoulders. And the British Museum is to make a public treasure of the record of his infamy, and keep it for him until such time as it may be published without unpleasant legal consequences. For myself, I do not care twopence about the contents of this manuscript. I was anxious that it should be read out word for word in court at the Ransome trial. If this had been done, and the counsel for the defence had dared to cross-examine me on it in detail, I should have won my case. On the insistence of my counsel, a pretence was made of reading it, but not 20 pages had been got through before Mr. Justice Darling intervened, and the reading of the manuscript as a whole was discontinued. Thereafter, only such portions were read as were supposed to be greatly to my detriment. Although these passages were read, I was never so much as asked, either by judge or counsel, to say if there was any truth in them. Wilde had written them in mad rage, when he was caged up in a squalid jail, a disgraced and whimpering convict, and, of course, they must be true. The judge himself pointed out that prisoners are apt to slander and unreason, but he did not tell the jury that they must take no notice of what had been read. Oscar Wilde had written it. Oscar Wilde was a man of genius, and they must form their own conclusions. The veriest tyro in law will tell you that such a document as this is no evidence at all, and ought not to have been admitted. Yet it was admitted, and parts selected by the defence were allowed to go to the jury. I think that common sense and common justice demanded that we should have had all or none. If the British Museum authorities did not fully appreciate the nature of the manuscript at the time of its acceptance, they have had every opportunity of making themselves conversant with its meaning and intention through what took place at the trial. They must surely have recognized that it is capable of being put, and indeed has been put, to the basest and most cowardly uses, and that it is, in essence, of absolutely no other use. For all that, it is still preserved, as though it were a literary gem of the first water, instead of something which mankind at large would be quite willing to let die. I am in no position to fight the British Museum for the possession of this abominable curiosity. If it had come into my hands at any time prior to the Ransome trial, it would have been simply thrown on the fire, not because I am afraid of it, or because any of my family are afraid of it, but because, when all is said, I should have had too much respect for Wilde's memory, and too much regard for letters, ever to consent to its publication. But it has never been in my hands, and it is now no longer possible for it to be kept secretly. Responsible persons at the British Museum may well be left to their own reflections upon the wisdoms of preserving this mummified libel. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Oscar Wilde and Myself by Lord Alfred Douglas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ransome's critical study. I'm not going to trouble the reader with an account of the life and works of Mr. Arthur Ransome, one of whose claims to fame lies in the fact that he was a defendant in the Ransome trial. His critical study of Oscar Wilde is a lumbering, apologetic performance dedicated to Robert Ross, and with an evident regard for the opinions of Ross, even where criticism is concerned. The passages in it which I held to be libellous upon myself have been expunged, and, according to Ransome, this was done with a view to sparing my feelings. The edition current among the public, however, is not published by the original publishing house, but by another firm, and both this firm and Mr. Ransome will, doubtless, be startled to hear that if they had ventured to insert the pages of which I complained in the edition for which they are responsible, I should have immediately served writs for libel upon them, and taken my chances of another evisceration in the witness box. Possibly Mr. Ransome had no inkling of this when he put his wonderfully magnanimous note to the new edition, but his publishers are wise people. Ransome's critical study, at a shilling, has been planted on Smith's stalls and at all the shilling bookselling booths throughout the country ever since the trial, with the name Oscar Wilde printed large on the dust cover, and the name of Ransome not quite so large. I'm going to take the edition as it stands, because the original edition was withdrawn by the publishers and can only have had a very limited circulation. It deals with the facts of Wilde's life in the briefest way, and is devoted mainly to a pretentious discussion of Wilde's writings. I may best sum up its critical announcements by saying that they are all of them what Ross would have liked them to be. Beginning with the poems, Ransome assures us that Ravenna is an admirable prize poem. He tells us that Wilde's early poems are rich in imitations and full of variations of other men's music, adding that they are variations to which the personality of the virtuoso has given a certain uniformity. Certain is good, in view of the fact that these poems are most distinctly not uniform in any single quality which appertains to poetry. Of Wilde's apings of Milton, he says, "Some of those exercises, which are among the most interesting he wrote, suggest the new view of the morale of imitation." And he goes on to tell us that Wilde made himself, as it were, the representative poet of his period. People who have heard of Rossetti and Swinburne, but never read them, were able to recover their self-respect by purchasing Wilde. Was ever such arrant nonsense put before a confiding public, even at a shilling? Mr. Ransome was in swaddling clothes when Wilde's early volume was going through its 5 editions. Otherwise, he would know that for one person who recovered his self-respect by purchasing Wilde, there were 50 people who were purchasing and reading Swinburne and Rossetti without worrying about their self-respect at all. Mr. Ransome is full of admiration for the early poems as a body. He cannot deny that the young man's verse was grossly derivative, or that Milton, Dante, Marlowe, Keats, Browning, and others make up a goodly list of sufferers by this light-hearted corsair's piracies. But he asks the reader to believe that Wilde's plagiarism was a really pretty gift and all to the advantage of letters, and that the poems are to be valued as the early work of a great man, and, for that matter, a great poet. I should have wished that Mr. Ransome might have given us a more explicit condemnation of the moral aspect of the Sphinx. His final remark is that it is as if a man were finding solace for his feverish hands in the touch of cool hard stones, and at the same time stimulating his fever by the sexual excitement of contrast between the oversensitive and the utterly insensible. Whatever this may mean. On the prose, Mr. Ransome spreads his butter very thick, and, by way of apology and blessing for Dorian Gray, he has the following specious paragraphs. Perhaps the reason why it was so loudly accused of immorality was that in the popular mind luxury and sin are closely allied, and the unpardonable mannerism that made him preach in a parable against the one did not hide his whole-hearted delight in describing the other. Dorian Gray, for all its faults, is such a book. It is unbalanced, and that is a fault. It is a mosaic hurriedly made by a man who reached out in all directions and took and used in his work whatever scrap of jasper or porphyry or broken flint was put into his hand, and that is not a virtue. But in it there is an individual essence, a private perfume, a colour whose secret has been lost. There are moods whose consciousness, that essence, perfume, colour, is needed to intensify. And all this, mind you, of a book which Wilde himself called poisonous, and which Mr. Ransome's own publishers, Messrs. Methuen, declined to include at any price in their various editions of Wilde's works. There is a great deal to pretty much the same effect about intentions and the plays. Everything that Wilde has done is wonderful from the Ransome point of view, and his literary faults and failings are beautifully explained away, or made the occasion for the handing up of bouquets, until we come right down to the appended, somewhat mild reproof. In 1889, before the maleficent flood of gold was pouring upon him, he had become accustomed to indulge the vice that, openly alluded to in the days and verses of Catullus, is generally abhorred and hidden in our own. I have previously shown that Ransome goes out of his way in another place to indicate that Wilde's best work was done during the period when he was an habitual devotee to the vice in question, and he is not content even with this subtle hint, but goes on to suggest that Wilde's knowledge of his own infamy may have induced in him a heightened ardour of production. I am aware that the impropriety of this sort of criticism can be readily explained away on the ground that it is honest or scientific, but the fact remains that such criticism must convey some vague suggestion that the literary result, in Wilde's case at least, was an excuse for the vice. Such an impression should not be derivable from what professes to be a critical study of literary work. It is the custom of all persons who wish to defend dubious or immoral publications, such as I judge some of Wilde's works to be, to assert that the same thing is done in France, which country they assert to be the mother of all the arts, and that nobody complains and no harm has accrued. If this were true of the French, or any other people, I do not know that it would be a good argument, but as a matter of fact it is not true. Frenchmen have undoubtedly been the greatest sinners in the composition of undesirable books, and that they are beginning to reap what they have sown is quite evident from the condition of French public morals today. France admits that the greatest of her social problems at the moment lies in the utterly vicious and decadent tendencies of French youth, particularly of the lower and middle classes. But Frenchmen are beginning to perceive that just as the apache and the adolescent criminal are the direct outcome of the neglect of religious and moral teaching in the French national schools, so the unsavoury intellectual art-mongers and wild worshippers, who are so thick upon the ground in middle-class French society, owe themselves, in the main, to the pernicious literature upon which the French law places no check. It may be useful to remember here that even in the great and glorious centre of artistic freedom, Paris, the authorities declined to allow the proposed monument to be erected over Wilde's grave in Père Lachaise until certain modifications had been made in the work. It was a bitter blow to some of the Wilde faction, but the authorities of Paris were inexorable, and those responsible for the monument learned a lesson that they could not do as they liked, even in France. I do not say that Mr. Ransome has anything to do with this, but I do say that anybody who, by so much as a word or a phrase, minimizes Wilde's vices or vicious writing in the name of art, is not sufficiently alive to the danger of one of the most scandalous movements that has ever excited and betrayed mankind. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Oscar Wilde and Myself by Lord Alfred Douglas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. My actions for libel. The number of writs which I have had from time to time to issue over the Wilde affair is past my count. If I had invoked the law on every occasion upon which I have been libelled over it, I suppose that the fees for writs alone would have run into hundreds of pounds. For some years I allowed people to say whatever they might choose to say about me, without lifting a finger against them. I believed in Wilde, who was my friend. I believed in his genius, and I had an exaggerated opinion about the value of some of his writings. It seemed to me that time would set me right, and it seemed to me important, both for Wilde's sake and the sake of letters, that I should avoid, so far as was possible, stirring up the mud which I knew lay at the bottom of his life. By the time Wilde came out of prison, I formed a sort of habit of taking no notice whatever of either his or my detractors. After his death, I let everybody who had known him rush into print about him without offering the slightest contribution to the discussion. Sherard produced 2 books purporting to be biographies of Wilde. Other books on Wilde have been written by various hands. Mr. Ingleby has written a life, and I believe biographies have been published in America. I can honestly say, however, that I have not troubled even to read any of these works. Though I have quoted from Sherard in the present volume, I have not read either of his books through. Ingleby's book I have glanced at, and Ransome's Critical Study I read through for the first time in July of last year. My opinions as to the importance of Wilde's writings began to change as my reading extended, and my mind took hold of serious things. A man's critical judgment is not at its best at 28, especially in regard to the artistic productions of his intimates. Even when we were together, I had told Wilde over and over again that he overrated himself, and that he was not by any means the great man he believed himself to be. To give him his due, he agreed with me. Nevertheless, after his death I held his memory as a friend, and, if you like, even as a literary figure, in such regard that I never so much as dreamed of saying or writing anything which would be likely to injure him. We had had our differences. I knew that he had written me one angry letter in prison, and I knew that for reasons of their own his intimates hated me. But he had apologized to me for his anger, and admitted that it was unrighteous and ill-founded. I did everything that a man could do to succour and help him, and make life possible for him after he left prison, and I was unremitting in kindness to him right down to the time of his death. He, for his part, seemed to be most kindly and affectionately disposed towards me, and, for aught I knew to the contrary, would gladly have done for me what I gladly did for him if our positions had been reversed. This thing is certain, that during the whole of our close intimacy in Naples and Paris subsequent to his downfall, he never once said or even hinted to me that he had anything to blame me for, or that, whether as regards finance or any other matters, I had treated him otherwise than generously, and as one friend should treat another. He was a clever man, and, in his way, a singularly astute man, but I never imagined that he was either clever or astute enough to keep up a show of affectionate friendship for a man whom he hated during the years that elapsed between his leaving Berneval and his death. At the last he drank a great deal more than was good for him, and when alcohol began to have a power over him and make him drunk, the wine was in and the wit was out, in Oscar Wilde's case, just as in any other man's. If he had cherished resentments against me, and had succeeded in hiding them when he was sober, I should have thought he would have given me an inkling of them when he was drunk, but he never did. Yet all the time the manuscript of De Profundis was in existence, and Mr. Ross held his instructions to publish it. Now, when I found in a book, which was obviously intended to be the apotheosis of Wilde, but was dedicated to Ross, and which claimed to put forth the major facts of Wilde's life on the authority of Ross as to biographical details, statements to the effect that I'd been in some way responsible for his public obloquy, and that I basely deserted him when his money was spent, I cannot see that there was any possible course open to me but to have the matter threshed out in a court of law. I accordingly issued writs upon the whole of the parties who were legally concerned, that is to say, on the author, the publisher, the printers, and a representative firm of distributors. The printers apologized, and the publisher withdrew the book from circulation, and they were allowed to drop out of the action. The Times Book Club put in a defence on technical grounds, and Ransome, for his part, put in a plea of justification. That plea could never have been framed without the assistance and cooperation of Ross. I knew perfectly well what it would, in all probability, contain before I ever saw it. It was never really put to the jury. Recourse was had to other measures. Ross was in possession of a few old letters of mine. The British Museum had the unpublished parts of De Profundis. Truth had the letters which I had addressed to Labouchere, and Messrs. Russell, a firm of solicitors of which the Honourable Charles Russell is the principal, produced, I presume under subpoena, the idiot letter from Wilde to myself, which my father produced at Wilde's trial at the Old Bailey. Of my letters to Wilde, Ross, and Labouchere, there is, since they were not in the defendant's possession, no mention whatever in the defendant's affidavit of documents, and consequently I had no warning of them. Of the De Profundis manuscript I was given due notice, and, of course, I knew that Wilde's own letter, which is a letter which reflects discredit on Wilde rather than on anybody else, would be sure to turn up. So that my letters to Wilde and Ross, and the letters to Truth, the former 16 years old, and the latter 18 or 20 years old, were sprung on me as I stood in the witness box. They proved absolutely nothing, but it was natural that they should make prejudice, and I complain not that they were produced, but that they were produced without my being given an opportunity of perusing them and calling to mind the circumstances in which they were written. I said in the witness box what I sincerely felt and feel, namely, that I am ashamed of having written them, but I will say here and now what I tried to say then, which is that the other side ought to be much more ashamed of having produced them. What the defence really did, in effect, was to say, if you didn't ruin Wilde and desert him because he had no more money to spend on you, you did something else which justifies us in saying anything we like about you. In point of fact, this is always what happens where actions for libel are concerned. You libel a man in a most cruel and vicious way, and if he takes an action against you, you go to court and libel him still further. Mr. Ransome got his verdict, and, though I would have appealed against it if I had possessed the means, he is fully entitled to it in law. He is entitled to go on saying that I ruined Wilde, or that I lived on Wilde, till he is black in the face, if he can get anybody to print and stand the racket of it. But who will believe him? Even with the jury's verdict to give it sanction, the thing is too preposterous for words. The Ransome affair had made no particular difference to me, but what has it done for Wilde? Here were these people with 2 short paragraphs which had nothing to do with and could not possibly help their book in the least. When I started my action against them, I did not ask for damages and should have been content with a withdrawal of the paragraphs, and, in the long run, they have had to be withdrawn. If this had been done before the trial, I should never have known of the existence of the unpublished parts of De Profundis, and the public would never have known of them till 1960. The present book would not have been written, and the Wilde myth would have gone merrily on its way rejoicing, until it was exploded by process of time. So that clearly Wilde profits nothing, but, on the whole, loses disastrously, and perhaps prematurely, and his tumble has been brought about by the very persons who profess to be his most devoted and zealous friends. Knowing what they must have known, and particularly knowing that I had not asked for damages, they would have taken good care that no action took place if they had sufficiently valued Wilde. They are £1,500 out of pocket, and the radiant picture of Oscar Wilde, which they had been at pains to limn, can be radiant no more. Even Mr. Justice Darling and Mr. F.E. Smith cannot save it in its pristine beauty. The former was kind enough to explain to a crowded court that Lord Alfred Douglas might have achieved some success in letters if he had put his talents to assiduous use, while the latter said that Lord Alfred Douglas had, in some way which was not explained, outraged every tradition of his class. Mr. Justice Darling forgot that I am still the possessor of a pen far more able than his own, and Mr. F. E. Smith forgot that, unlike himself, I belong to a class which takes no stock in cant, and is not to be put down by windy rhetoric. A class, too, which does not look to Mr. Horatio Bottomley for a push into prominence. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Oscar Wilde and Myself by Lord Alfred Douglas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Picture of Dorian Gray. Wilde had written and published The Picture of Dorian Gray 2 years before I knew him. At the time of its appearance in Lippincott's magazine, I was an undergraduate at Oxford, and, so far as I know, neither Wilde nor myself had ever set eyes on one another. I mention this because it has been pretended that Wilde took me for the model for one of his beastly characters. Dates are pretty stubborn things, however, and there can be no doubt whatever that The Picture of Dorian Gray was published in 1890. Not only so, but by the time I came to know Wilde, the hubbub which the story had first created had altogether died away, and as I did not read the book with any sort of care or critical intention till years afterwards, it never entered into my mind that it expressed the peculiar views of life which it is said to illustrate. Wilde talked about the book sometimes as a highly moral work, which had been hopelessly misunderstood by the critics, and he gave me a copy of it in which, as was his custom, he inscribed his name, and I did not read the book again until the time of my father's action against Wilde. Even then, I did not read it closely or with any grave attention. I took it for granted for what Wilde says it was, namely, a work of art with an excellent moral. And I do not wish to say now that it is not a work of art, or that it does not point a very splendid moral for morally disposed people. It has been reviewed as such in more than one important religious paper. At the time when I was editing the Academy, I blamed Messrs. Methuen for not having the pluck to include the book in their editions of Wilde's works. It seems to me preposterous that if a book can be sold openly at any English bookshop, it should be refused inclusion among the author's works by his own publishers. Since I made my protest on this matter, however, the whole question of Wilde and his books has undergone a marked, and, to my mind, a most dangerous change. I quite anticipated that the day would arrive when Wilde's disgrace might, in a sense, be dissociated from his writings. I looked to time and common sense to winnow out what was good in those writings, and reject what was noxious or deleterious. It never occurred to me that I should live to see Wilde used in the way in which he has been used, and is being used, to the endangerment of letters and morals. We are now face to face with this fact, namely, that there exists in England as well as in France, Germany, and Russia a distinct and recognizable Wilde cult, which has as its creed that Wilde was one of the greatest geniuses that ever lived. To this large following, which accepts Wilde's vices as a sign of genius, The Picture of Dorian Gray has proved to be a powerful weapon. It is a book after their own heart, and its wit and the moral which it points, or does not point, according as one may take it, enable these people to employ it in subtle and devious ways. I cannot help believing that Wilde must have intended Dorian Gray as a fleer at morality. In effect, he may be said to have laid himself out to write a sermon the interest of which should really depend on obscenities. He puts before us one of the vilest of human creatures, and, without particularizing as to the nature of his vileness, brings him to an infamous and therefore poetically just end. But the danger of the thing lies in that, While 9 people out of 10 could not have told you at the time of the publication of the book wherein the peculiar sin of Dorian Gray lay, quite 90 people out of 100 can now tell you. What was laughed at for affectation in 1891 assumed a sinister and altogether an abominable aspect as the years went on, and the true effect and intention of Wilde's work began to make itself apparent. I am not going into details, but everybody knows what I mean. It may be interesting if I print in this place portions of a review of the story which appeared in the St. James's Gazette for June 24, 1890. Time was, it was in the 70s, when we talked about Mr. Oscar Wilde. Time came, and it was in the 80s, when he tried to write poetry, and, more adventurous, we tried to read it. Time is when we had forgotten him, or only remembered him as the late editor of the Woman's World, a part for which he was singularly unfitted, if we are to judge him by the work which he has been allowed to publish in Lippincott's magazine, and which Messrs. Ward, Locke and Company have not been ashamed to circulate in Great Britain. Not being curious in ordure, and not wishing to offend the nostrils of decent persons, we do not propose to analyse the picture of Dorian Gray. That would be to advertise the developments of an esoteric prurience. The puzzle is that a young man of decent parts, who enjoyed, when he was at Oxford, the opportunity of associating with gentlemen, should put his name, such as it is, to so stupid and vulgar a piece of work. Let nobody read it in the hope of finding witty paradox or racy wickedness. The writer airs his cheap research among the garbage of the French decadents like any drivelling pedant, and he bores you unmercifully with his prosy rigmaroles about the beauty of the body and the corruption of the soul. The grammar is better than Ouida's, the erudition equal, but in every other respect we prefer the talented lady who broke off with pious apasiapesis when she touched upon the horrors which are described in the pages of Suetonius and Livy, not to mention the yet worse infamies believed by many scholars to be accurately portrayed in the lost works of Plutarch, Venus, and Nicodemus, especially Nicodemus. Let us take one peep at the young men in Mr. Oscar Wilde's story. Puppy number 1 is the painter of a picture of Dorian Gray. Puppy number 2 is the critic, a courtesy lord, skilled in all the knowledge of the Egyptians, and weary of all the sins and pleasures of London. Puppy number 3 is the original, cultivated by puppy number 1 with a romantic friendship. The puppies are all talking. Puppy number 1 about his heart, puppy number 2 about his sins and the pleasures of sin, and puppy number 3 about himself, always about himself, and generally about his face, which is brainless and beautiful. The puppies appear to fill up the intervals of talk by plucking daisies and playing with them, and sometimes by drinking something with strawberries in it. The youngest puppy is told he is charming, but he mustn't sit in the sun for fear of spoiling his complexion. When he is rebuked for being a naughty, wilful boy, he makes a pretty muet, this man of 20. This is how he is addressed by the blasé puppy at their first meeting. "Yes, Mr. Gray, the gods have been good to you, but what the gods give they quickly take away. When your mouth goes, your beauty will go with it, and then you will suddenly discover that there are no triumphs left for you. Time is jealous of you and wars against your lilies and roses. You will become sallow and hollow-cheeked and dull-eyed. You will suffer horribly." Why, bless our souls, haven't we read something of this kind somewhere in the classics? Yes, of course we have. But in what recondite author? Ah, yes. No. Yes. It was in Horace. What an advantage it is to have received a classical education, and how it will astonish the Yankees. But we must not forget our puppies, who have probably occupied their time in lapping something with strawberries in it. Puppy number 1, the art puppy, has been telling puppy number 3, the dull puppy, how much he admired him. What is the answer? "I am less to you than your ivory Hermes or your silver fawn. You will like them always. How long will you like me? Till I have my first wrinkle, I suppose. I know now that when one loses one's good looks, whatever they may be, one loses everything. I am jealous of the portrait you have painted of me. Why should it keep what I must lose? Oh, if it was only the other way! If the picture could only change, and I could be always what I am now!" No sooner said than done. The picture does change, the original doesn't. Here is a situation for you. Théophile Gautier could have made it romantic, entrancingly beautiful. Mr. Stevenson could have made it convincing, humorous, pathetic. Mr. Anstey could have made it screamingly funny. It has been reserved for Mr. Oscar Wilde to make it dull and nasty. The promising youth plunges into every kind of mean depravity, and ends in being cut by fast women and vicious men. He finishes with murder, and every wickedness or filthiness committed by Dorian Gray is faithfully registered upon his face in the picture, but his living features are undisturbed and unmarred by his inward vileness. This is the story which Mr. Oscar Wilde has tried to tell. A very lame story it is, and very lamely it is told. Why has he told it? There are 2 explanations, and, so far as we can see, not more than 2. Not to give pleasure to his readers. The thing is too clumsy, too tedious, and, alas that we should say it, too stupid. Perhaps it was to shock his readers in order that they might cry fie upon him and talk about him. Are we then to suppose that Mr. Oscar Wilde has yielded to the craving for a notoriety which he once earned by talking fiddle-faddle about other men's art, and sees his only chance of recalling it by making himself obvious at the cost of being obnoxious, and by attracting the notice which the olfactory sense cannot refuse to the presence of certain self-asserting organisms? That is an uncharitable hypothesis, and we would gladly abandon it. It may be suggested, but is it more charitable, that he derives pleasure from treating a subject merely because it is disgusting. The phenomenon is not unknown in recent literature, and it takes 2 forms, in appearance widely separate. In fact, 2 branches from the same root, a root which draws its life from malodorous putrefaction. One development is found in the Puritan prurience which produced Tolstoy's Kreutzer Sonata and Mr. Stead's famous outbursts. That is odious enough and mischievous enough, and it is rightly execrated because it is tainted with a hypocrisy not the less culpable because charitable people may believe it to be unconscious. But is it more odious or more mischievous than the frank paganism which delights in dirtiness and confesses its delight? Still, they are both chips from the same block, the maiden tribute of modern Babylon and the picture of Dorian Gray, and both of them ought to be chucked into the fire, not so much because they are dangerous and corrupt, as because they are incurably silly, written by simple posers, whether they call themselves Puritan or pagan, who know nothing about the life which they affect to have explored, and because they are mere catchpenny revelations of the non-existent, which, if they reveal anything at all, are revelations only of the singularly unpleasant minds from which they emerge. The last paragraph is significant as bearing out what I have said with regard to the difference between the public morals of the time when the picture of Dorian Gray was first published, and the public morals of today. The review as a whole did not please Wilde, and he wrote to the editor of the St. James's Gazette to say that he was quite incapable of understanding how any work of art can be criticised from a moral standpoint. This, plainly, was no answer to the review, nor can it be answered with reasonable argument. A similarly cutting article which appeared in the Daily Chronicle described Dorian Gray as a mixture of dullness and dirt, a tale spawned from the leprous literature of the French decadents, a poisonous book, the atmosphere of which is heavy with the mephitic odours of moral and spiritual putrefaction, a gloating study of the mental and physical corruption of a fresh, fair, and golden youth. There is not a single good and holy impulse of human nature, scarcely a fine feeling or instinct that civilization, art, and religion have developed throughout the ages as part of the barriers between humanity and animalism, that is not held up to ridicule and contempt in Dorian Gray," continued the Chronicle. To which, and a great deal more of similarly scathing comment, Wilde could muster up no better reply than to say, "My story is an essay on decorative art. It reacts against the crude brutality of plain realism. It is poisonous, if you like, but you cannot deny that it is also perfect, and perfection is what we artists aim at." Neither the St. James's Gazette nor the Daily Chronicle could foresee that a book which they took to be the outcome of prowlings and garbage hunting among the French decadents would come to be the gospel and literary standby of a worldwide cult of moral and physical leprosy. But the thing has come to pass, and Dorian Gray goes on accomplishing its mission, unquestioned by criticism, unchecked by authority, and belauded by every half-baked youth who can earn a precarious shilling by dabbling in ink. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Oscar Wilde and Myself by Lord Alfred Douglas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Literature and Vice. With much more wisdom than appears on the surface of the remark, Mr. Ransome tells us in the Critical Study that it is scarcely 20 years since Wilde wrote his books, and in poetry as well as in prose, their influence is already becoming so common as not to be recognized. This is true, and true in the worst sense. Every objectionable book that is published at a reasonable price increases the trend, considered impossible at one time in this country, but now obviously marked, towards a want of decency in our national literature. By a singular irony, the criticism of the day is largely in the hands of radicals and nonconformists, many of whom, by an irony still more singular, are engaged in the propagation of loose and pernicious doctrine. I would like to wager that the present book will be attacked with the greatest fury in precisely the quarters where, 20 years ago, it would have been applauded. If I wish to see Wilde and his work spoken of with the greatest respect and the greatest admiration, I have nothing to do but turn to certain radical or nonconformist sheets, and I shall be at once obliged. I am of opinion that certain novels, and even certain magazines and reviews, now published in England, would never have existed at all but for Oscar Wilde. One of the monthly reviews is a particular offender, and the infection is not limited to one paper only. Nobody seems to be shocked or distressed by the fact, and nobody lifts a voice or a pen by way of complaint. The journals I have in my mind are, in the main, respectable and reasonably cultivated publications. They are above purchase or corruption in regard to their general conduct, being owned by rich men or syndicates, and run in some instances at a loss, or, at any rate, no particular profit, and for the good of the political interests they represent. They take a high tone with regard to political and social morality. They contain general articles, stories, sketches, and so forth, which are beyond reproach both as regards their tone and their literary qualities. Yet, when it comes to dealing with literature itself, they may be found only too frequently on the side of the palpably dubious and undesirable. I have had several years of editorial experience of my own, and out of that experience I think I can explain the phenomenon. It simply amounts to this. Editors are too busy, or too careless, to select their reviewers judiciously, and, when a book has been reviewed, they are too busy or too careless to examine the reviewer's work with a view to making sure that it is free from the current taints. It is a fact that the younger school of critics, and many of the old ones, now base themselves on Wilde's dictum that a work of art cannot be criticized from a moral standpoint, and that the sphere of art and the sphere of ethics are absolutely distinct and separate. If the result were that the reviewer contented himself with the consideration of literary work qua art, and in no other relation, there would perhaps be no great harm done. But in point of fact this is seldom or never done, and it is next door to impossible that it should be done. Opinions and moral reflections insist on finding their way even into works of art, and literary works of art are, by their very nature, almost entirely made up of them. In spite of his own denial of the interrelation between art and morals, Wilde always asserted that Dorian Gray had a moral. That is to say, when it suited him to make the assertion. It is obvious that any 4 lines of serious verse must have had some sort of a moral bearing, and so every poem has a moral, and every story has a moral, and every piece of writing has a moral, implied, even if it be not specifically stated. Now, the new reviewer, and all of the old ones, know this as well as I do. They cannot divide art from morality, and when they pretend to do so, it will usually be found that they are really condoning, defending, upholding, or propagating obvious immorality. I do not wish it to be supposed that the review columns of English journals bristle with this sort of thing, but there can be no doubt that it crops up from time to time, and with a sufficient frequency to make it quite plain that the press is far more easy and tolerant on the matter than it has any right to be. Obviously, letters is a vehicle which is handier than any other vehicle for the spread of evil thinking. An improper picture is improper on the face of it, and calls immediate attention to itself and immediate reproof from decent people. Such pictures cannot really exist publicly. An improper play has to get past the censor, and it has also to overcome the repugnance of persons who do not like openly to be assisting in wickedness. Both picture and play, too, have to be, in the nature of things, either decent or frankly and palpably indecent. But in a book you can have dubiety, and you can have patches of impropriety and indecency tucked away amid a mass of inoffensive and, it may be, even excellent writing. This is particularly the case with regard to novels and poetry, and nobody with any care for either literature or the public well-being can help but regret it. The only censorship which can do anything to stem the increasing tide of looseness and license in these regards is, obviously, criticism. I maintain that the criticism of the day is, in a preponderating measure, consciously or unconsciously, in agreement with Wilde on these subjects, and the result is plain for all of us to see. I used to believe that art is more important than conduct. This is a mistake which most of us are prone to make when we are young and dazzled with the beauty and colour of life. The vast mass of mankind, however, are not concerned with art as art at all, but merely with art in its relation to its personal effect upon themselves. The average reader, whether of prose or verse, has little or no conscious interest in the art of either. If he had, many of the moderns with enormous circulation would feel a very considerable draught, inasmuch as they are not artists, and do not pretend to be. In view of the general ability to read and the extraordinary cheapness of books, it has become more than ever important that literature should be kept free from viciousness, prurience, and improper suggestion. If criticism fails in its duty in this respect, the national intellect and the national morals will inevitably be debased, and the proper purposes of art utterly destroyed. It is the fashion to say that great authors do not write merely for youth and young misses at school, but it is nevertheless a fact that it is upon the adolescent of both sexes that these authors have to depend, in the main, for a hearing, and for reputation and income. In the case of Wilde, it is to youth particularly that he very largely appeals. Most persons of middle life know a great deal more about the facts of existence than would admit them to take Wilde for anything but a flippant and unbalanced writer. The wise perceive that there is no gingerbread beneath his gilt, and they know that even the gilt is not honest metal. His influence upon youth is undoubted and obvious, but it is equally undoubted and obvious that his influence is a bad one, and the sooner we acknowledge the fact, the better it will be for art and letters. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Oscar Wilde and Myself by Lord Alfred Douglas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Crossland and the First Stone. To be properly understood in this world is beyond human expectation. That my relations with Wilde have been misunderstood, this narrative bears witness. Pretty well everything I have done or said with respect to him has been misconstrued or misrepresented, and, of course, it was not a matter of surprise to me to find that when Crossland published The First Stone, some devotees took it for granted that I had suborned him to do it. Their rage knew no bounds. On the appearance of the book, half the editors in London were besieged with letters from adherents of Wilde, whose identity was and is entirely unknown to me, abusing Crossland and explaining that it was well known that I had instigated him to write the work and paid for the publication. So far as I am aware, none of these letters was printed, and when the writers of them found that they could not get the publicity they required, they took to sending copies of them to Crossland and myself. Ultimately, somebody went to the length of printing a pamphlet in which both of us were accused of all sorts of vileness. This pamphlet appeared without the name of its author, and without the name or address of the printer and publisher. Those responsible for it lacked the courage of their opinions, but they had pluck enough to post it out under cover and to say that copies of it could be obtained at some address in Chelsea. I had inquiries made at the address given, and found that it consisted of a block of flats, but that there was nobody there who would admit any knowledge of the matter. The pamphlet was called The Writing on the Floor, but nobody who lived on any of the floors of these flats, from the basement upwards, would own to the slightest connection with it. I mention these facts not because I attach any importance to the pamphlet, but because they show to what extraordinary courses my enemies will have resort when their malice gets the better of them. They indicate, too, that there is no limit to the resources of these people. The difficulties of obtaining a printer, whether in London or the provinces, for such statements as were contained in The Writing on the Floor, must have been well nigh insuperable. No printer who can read could, in ordinary circumstances, have been procured to produce such a pamphlet, even without his imprimatur, on any terms whatever. He would know full well that the risks were too great. More crass and abominable criminal libels were never put into type. The thing could only have been printed either abroad or at a private press, and, from the character of the type and paper, I should say that the chances are that the printing was done at a private press in England. The type was new, and the paper such as is readily obtainable in London. All this meant considerable cost, upon which the authors of the pamphlet could not hope to recoup themselves, inasmuch as they gave it away and did not set a price upon it, besides which there was a cost of postage and clerical work, so that we had here not only malice and wicked propaganda, but malice and wicked propaganda which were willing to go to great expense and to run great risks for the expression of themselves. This business, and other similar businesses which have come to my notice, tend to convince me that there are plenty of minor enthusiasts engaged in the canonization of Wilde, and that they lack neither means nor energy. I use the phrase minor enthusiast advisedly, because I wish to make it clear that I do not suggest that any person named in this book was a party to these letters or anonymous scurrilities. With regard to the first stone itself, I have no wish to apologize for it, and should not have the slightest objection to accepting the responsibility for it, if it were mine to accept. But it is not mine, nor did I suggest or advise it, or have hand or part in its production. What happened was this. When I obtained through my solicitors a copy of the unpublished parts of De Profundis, duly authenticated by Messrs. Lewis and Lewis, I took it, without reading it, to Mr. Crossland. I did this of my own initiative and for my own reasons. Crossland began to read it in my presence. He had not read more than a page or two before he said, "I am going to read this manuscript to you word for word, and I am going to put absolutely flat and straight questions to you, even though they hurt or anger you." I said, "You can read away, my dear chap, and ask me any questions you like." I sat there for 4 solid hours, face to face with a man who probably knows more about me and my life and my manner of living it than anybody else in the world, and I am free to say that he did not spare me. But it is necessary to remember that, up to this time, Crossland had never had any other version of the history and my connection with Wilde than my own. When he first met me in 1903, over the publication of some of my sonnets, we had not talked together 3 minutes before he plumped me with some sharp questions in regard to myself and Wilde. I was able at once to give him straightforward and convincing answers, and, in good times and bad, from that day to this, he has believed me, as indeed he could not help but believe me, and he has always and rightly acted on the assumption that he knew the truth. But I remembered those questions of his, and it was partly for this reason, namely, that I courted all the questions he could devise, that I went round to him with the unpublished De Profundis. Here was new material of which neither he nor I had ever had the smallest inkling. I knew that it could not be friendly material, otherwise it would not have been put up by Ransome's solicitors. Yet I placed it unreservedly in the hands of my closest friend, a critically minded person of whom it may be said, at least, that neither friendship nor any other consideration will hold or restrain him where matters of principle are concerned. After reading the manuscript, Crossland went to work of his own accord, and within a very few days the first stone was written and printed. Whatever may be its merits or faults as a piece of writing, it is certainly of interest as exhibiting the effect of an honest mind of Wilde's stupid and ludicrous outburst. I am not concerned either to praise or blame the poem. but it will last Wilde probably a good deal longer than the unpublished parts of De Profundis will last me. I had intended to republish the whole poem in this book, but as it contains quotations taken direct from the unpublished portion of De Profundis, I have been reluctantly compelled to abandon my intention. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Oscar Wilde and Myself by Lord Alfred Douglas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A challenge to Mr. Ross. I do not know what Mr. Robert Ross's legal rights as Wilde's literary executor were until the year 1906, when his position was officially confirmed. During the last years of his life, Wilde certainly looked to me to do all that might be necessary to be done in regard to his literary affairs after his death. Ross knew this, and other people knew it. Both Wilde and I, however, had been accustomed to look upon him as a businessman, and I quite admit that when he came to me after the funeral and asked me what should be done with Wilde's papers, I told him to act as he thought fit. The first occasion upon which Ross used the title of literary executor was in Paris after the funeral. Somebody in an English paper had suggested that Wilde had been buried without ceremony, and that none of his friends had thought it worth while to attend the funeral. I considered that this was an improper statement, and a long telegram was written and sent to the paper in question, the Daily Express, with a view to its correction. The question arose as to whether I should sign it, or whether somebody else should sign it, and in the end we decided that the signature should be Ross's. After Ross had put his name to the telegram, he said to me, "It will carry more weight if I were to put literary executor to Oscar Wilde under my name." I saw no objection to this at the time, and Ross added the words, and the telegram was dispatched so signed. So far as I am aware, that is the only mandate Ross ever had from anybody. I do not doubt that his position has been confirmed and made legal since by the receiver of Wilde's estate and by Wilde's sons. Neither do I doubt that Ross has rendered valuable services to the estate and administered it justly and well. I think that he has done many things which are scarcely in Wilde's interest, however, and of which Wilde would have disapproved, such, for example, as his publication of the version of the Ballad of Reading Gaol, curtailed, for the benefit of reciters and their audiences, and his dedication of intentions to a woman whom Wilde scarcely knew, in his own name rather than Wilde's. But these are minor matters, and there is no need to labour them. The challenge I have to issue to Mr. Ross has to do with the question of De Profundis. It is admitted by all parties concerned that this manuscript was addressed to me. A portion of the work has already been published, under Mr. Ross's sanction. The other half he has presented to the nation through the British Museum. So that it is evident that Mr. Ross feels that the whole manuscript should be preserved. Sufficient of the contents of the second or unpublished part has been made public in the law courts and in the press to make it quite obvious that the manuscript relates chiefly to me, and relates to me in a very bitter, malicious, and libellous way. It is consequently a document in which at least two living persons are very seriously concerned. Neither Mr. Ross nor any other person dare print or publish the thing as it stands, because of its libellous character, and they know quite well that, apart from any action I might take, the Dowager Marchioness of Queensberry would be absolutely sure to take action against them if the manuscript were published. Mr. Ross therefore stores this libel at the British Museum till 1960, when, in the course of human events, my mother will have passed away, and I too shall be dead. At this happy juncture, the discretion of the British Museum authorities is to come into play. As a matter of fact, however, The manuscript will be out of copyright by 1960, and unless the British Museum destroy it meanwhile, which, by the way, they would not be within their legal rights in doing, there is nothing to hinder publication, inasmuch as it is open knowledge that copies exist and are in other hands than those in the British Museum. Now, I think it will be commonly admitted that a person who is attacked possesses de facto the right to reply. Furthermore, it is the duty of a person who knows that he has been accused, as I have been accused, to defend and clear himself if he can. Therefore it is that I conceive it to be my duty thoroughly to sift and examine the charges which Oscar Wilde has brought against me, and to rebut them, and give proof that they are false and unsubstantial. It is impossible that this can be done completely and satisfactorily unless I have from Mr. Ross, who, rightly or wrongly, considers himself the legal owner of the copyright, permission to print very lengthy portions of the manuscript, now in the hands of the British Museum. In view of the subtle way in which the manuscript is written, it would not be sufficient for my purpose to make extracts here and there, and deal with them singly. The only proper method in the circumstances would be to print the unpublished De Profundis in extenso with my running comment, either beneath it or on the opposite pages. Mr. Ross is acquainted with the whole contents of this manuscript, and he contends that he is the owner of the copyright. I challenge him to give his permission for the manuscript to be used in the manner I have indicated. My proposition is a perfectly fair and square one. I will publish the whole manuscript, word for word and line for line, without omitting or curtailing anything, and over it I will publish my reply, and the public at large shall be left to judge between Oscar Wilde and Lord Alfred Douglas. Mr. Ross's acquiescence in this proposal cannot hurt him in the least. Nobody has anything to gain out of the manuscript, inasmuch as Mr. Ross dare not publish it himself, or get anybody else to publish it, in my lifetime or the lifetime of my mother. He knows that it is a libel on both of us, and the least he can do, if he is a fair-minded man, is to give me an opportunity of dealing openly and fully with the accusations involved. If he refuses to do this, I take it that the public will draw their own conclusions as to the truth or falsity of these accusations. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Oscar Wilde and Myself by Lord Alfred Douglas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Wilde in Russia, France and Germany. A stock argument of Wilde's critical friends has always been that, even if it can be demonstrated that Wilde has been grossly overrated in England, the fact of his popularity in foreign parts proves that there is in him the literary stuff which goes to the making of immortals. This, of course, is not philosophically true, being, in fact, the merest fudge. Wilde's books, it is true, have been translated into various languages. But which books? Well, Dorian Gray and Salome for the most part, with De Profundis for a bad third. And the rest? Nowhere. What Wilde abroad really means is very prettily indicated by the following letter which was addressed to the editor of Everyman by one of Wilde's translators. Sir, please let me produce some figures to uphold your correspondent's statement in your issue of June 6th as to Oscar Wilde's popularity in Russia. I have had the honour of translating Wilde's works into Russian, and can state that his books were among the best-selling fiction in this country. Some of Oscar Wilde's masterpieces, such as The Picture of Dorian Gray, De Profundis, Salome, published in popular editions at 10 kopecks, 2.5 pence, each have had a circulation, in the last 4 to 5 years, from 80 to 100,000 each, and are still selling briskly. Wilde's comedies are constantly on the repertory of the Moscow and St. Petersburg imperial state theatres, not counting the innumerable provincial stages. I can assure you that you will not find one educated person in Russia who has not read Wilde's works. I have received in the last 7 to 8 years hundreds of letters from quite unknown people all over Russia, with the expression of the strongest and sincerest admiration for one of the greatest writers in the world. I must frankly acknowledge that nearly all the letters of my correspondents, ranking from all classes of Russian life, contain many bitter comments on the treatment Wilde received in the hands of his countrymen. I am, sir, etc., Michael Lykiadopoulos, Secretary of the Moscow Art Theatre, Moscow. This letter gives a curious insight into the whole business. Of course, Dorian Gray and Salome at twopence halfpenny in England would sell like wildfire, just as a pirated De Profundis was sold a little while ago at a penny on the street corners. Nobody professed that this pirated De Profundis was being sold because of its literary value. It was sold and offered for sale in the gutter as The Confession of Oscar Wilde, and it was bought in just the same way that the alleged confession of any other criminal would be bought. So that these books at 10 kopecks in Russia point their own moral. I do not know how cheaply or how dearly Wilde is sold in Paris and Berlin, but I do know that the vogue he has in both cities is largely based on his iniquities, and that this fact is equally deplored by right-thinking Frenchmen and right-thinking Germans. In the scandals which of late years have disgraced Berlin, the Wilde factor has been only too evident. The scandals to which I refer have occurred in so-called literary and artistic circles, and wherever you have such scandals in such circles, there you are bound always to find that Oscar Wilde sits enthroned. It is a deplorable thing, doubtless, but what is one to expect in the face of Dorian Gray? The bad influence of Wilde in both France and Germany has been noted and deprecated by more than one eminent writer, and the main force of criticism in both countries is in arms against it. In Russia, his admirers belong chiefly to the anarchistic and revolutionary sections of the community, who, being in a large measure decadents and criminals themselves, have a natural sympathy with the work of a decadent criminal. In Russia they say Wilde must be a great man because he went to prison and is universally loved and admired by the English. In England we're told that Wilde's greatness cannot be disputed, inasmuch as he is loved and admired in Russia, at 10 kopecks a time. Mr. Ransome is very amusing on Wilde's foreign successes. He says that we cannot afford to neglect the opinion of critical Germany, which, in point of fact, is just the opinion we can afford to neglect, as he quotes Mr. Ross as follows. In 1901, within a year of the author's death, it, Salome, was produced in Berlin. From that moment it has held the European stage. It has run for a longer consecutive period in Germany than any play by any Englishman, not excepting Shakespeare. Its popularity has extended to all countries where it is not prohibited. It is performed throughout Europe, Asia, and America. It is played even in Yiddish. One would imagine that all Europe, Asia, and America had rushed in a body to see this compelling drama. The facts are that, while it may have been staged at theatres of standing in Berlin and other cities, and may have had a long run in Berlin, its vogue elsewhere is not associated with either distinguished theatres or the best actors, having been, in fact, a rather hole-and-corner affair, and whatever may have happened years ago, one may travel the globe nowadays without finding that Wilde comes anywhere near holding the stage in a substantial or perennial way. Wilde, of course, has been pushed and boomed for all he is worth, and for a good deal more than he is worth. The result is that he has come into a sort of artificial kingdom of his own, on the continent and in America just as in England. But I maintain that it is a kingdom based on rottenness, that it is an utterly insignificant kingdom in so far as it is taken to mean merit or worthiness in Wilde, and that, by its very nature, it is bound to fall and be forgotten. Wilde's supporters would appear to be very conscious of this fact, and that is perhaps why some of them fall into such fits of rage if anybody ventures to suggest that their idol is not entirely gold. There are no plays of Wilde's, and no books of Wilde's, which can last on their literary merits. His only chance is that he suffered imprisonment and he wrote certain improprieties. These have been put on a different basis for an enduring literary reputation, even in Asia or among the Jews. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Oscar Wilde and Myself by Lord Alfred Douglas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Smaller Fry. I suppose that the number of little poets, little fictionists, and above all little critics who imagine that they owe themselves to Wilde is infinite. His peculiar form of humour, which seemed to have genius behind it, and so dazzled everybody in Wilde's own time, was soon discovered to be woefully easy of imitation, and really to require very little brains in its production. The consequence has been that everybody who considered himself anybody took up with it, as it were, and it has become so common that it is no longer taken for humour at all. All our dullest young men who happen to be engaged or interested in a branch of the arts have talked, thought, and written Wilde for years past. Some middle-aged and elderly gentlemen who began when Wilde was at his zenith are still at it, and apparently nothing will stop them, which means, of course, that humour in England has altogether lost both its point and its usefulness. The humour of the day has a dull cruelty about it, which it formerly lacked. Its object might almost be not to make people laugh, but to make them cry. The fiercer and more heartless it is, the better it is supposed to be appreciated. Furthermore, instead of being kept in its proper place in the scheme of things, it has been allowed to run riot whenever its authors choose to let it loose. To be comic in a bitter and insincere way seems to be the ambition of most of the eminent people one can nowadays come across. We have comic judges and comic counsel who manage to keep the king's courts in ripples of merriment. We have even a comic magistrate or two. In Parliament, the mordant humorist and the man who can say sharp things are the only ones to be listened to. Sarcastic bishops and witty clerics abound. And as for the gentlemen of the press, they are all bent on the leer, at whatever cost. If you look closely into these professed or unprofessed fun-makers, you are bound to perceive that the majority of them are little Oscar Wildes to a man. They look on life with a confirmed squint, and they cannot see that there is anything human about which it is not desirable that they should make jokes. Only a little while back we had the spectacle of an English judge indulging his fancy in Wildisms in the course of a trial for murder. In itself, his lordship's epigram or paradox, or whatever you like to call it, would help or hurt nobody. But the fact that it was forthcoming in such circumstances indicates pretty plainly the pass to which we have come. Wilde's answer to everything was by quip or fleer, or a plain perversion of the truth. He had no serious views or intentions about anything, and he considered that the art of life lay in flippancy. People who read him and make a gospel of him can scarcely be expected not to imitate him, and imitate him they certainly do, so that nowadays we have hundreds of little Wildes, where formerly there was only one Wilde, and a not over big one at that. They swarm and spread themselves over everything that is decent, and they parrot Wilde at everybody who comes near them. They have seen it in Intentions that there is no sin save stupidity, and that all art is immoral, and they imagine that the world can be run on these two remarkably shallow and unreliable axioms. I am quite free to admit that in a literary sense the world does present the appearance of being so run. The prepondering weight of contemporary authorship and criticism would indeed seem to be on the Wilde side. This, of course, is unthinkably pitiable, but we cannot get beyond the fact. The reason is not far to seek, and it will be found to lie in the shallowness which always characterizes the popular view of large questions. Wilde began by asserting that the only sin was stupidity, yet he ended with the assertion that the supreme vice is shallowness. I do not say that shallowness is by any means the supreme vice. There can be no doubt, however, that it is the very commonest vice among people who imagine themselves to be thinkers. It is, in consequence of this very circumstance, that to attack Wilde nowadays is to be howled down, just as to have praised him 18 years ago was to be execrated. The shallowness of 1895 could not see an inch below the surface of Wilde's glaring viciousness. It went the length of taking his name off his own plays, and relegating him to the position of a man who was well nigh without literary existence. The shallowness of 1914 is unable to look beneath the success, enormous sales, enormous popularity, and what not, which have resulted from the Wilde boom, and it is quite incapable of recognizing or appreciating the dangers which lie beneath it. We are asked by tearful counsel and writers of pathetic nonsense for the penny weeklies to forget Wilde's vices. For my own part, I certainly do not wish to revive them or insist upon them, but I am not prepared to forget them unless his apologists cease to discuss them. Nobody will question that what has been termed the revulsion of feeling in Wilde's favour was largely brought about by the publication of De Profundis. This book, which, as I have shown, does not in the least accurately represent Wilde's feelings, owes its success in no small measure to the wide publicity which was given to the statements that it had been written in prison, and that it is a sort of repentant confession and authentic dying speech of its author. As we have seen, and as will become still more apparent when the unpublished De Profundis sees the light, nothing can be further from the truth. The small fry may go on admiring Wilde, and they may go on pointing to De Profundis as a work of a sainted martyr, the swan song of a contrite, broken and bleeding heart, and so on, as long as they please. But they will never get away from the hard facts of the case, which are quite the reverse of what has been generally assumed and supposed. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Oscar Wilde and Myself by Lord Alfred Douglas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. To be done with it all. When Wilde had completed the De Profundis manuscript, he is understood to have written to Ross to say that he had rid his bosom of much perilous stuff. I will do him the justice to agree that he got into the De Profundis manuscript as a whole more real Wilde than ever he put into any other piece of work. Before he had given us, as far as in him lay, Wilde the artist, with frequent glimpses of Wilde the shameful liver and vicious thinker. But in the complete De Profundis he gives us Wilde the man. The bottom of his vicious and halting soul is laid bare for us in this extraordinary work. That he had it in him to give himself utterly and entirely away as he did is incomprehensible, and can only be set down to the fact that the reticence which had previously been his safeguard and saviour was entirely destroyed by his rage on perceiving that the life he had succeeded in living would never again be possible to him. My own task is finished here and now. I have taken what is practically Wilde's own picture of himself and unveiled it. Before he went to prison, he had exposed to the public gaze a picture of himself which was all lights and rose and purple. To this picture his friends have been most faithful. Of their own initiative, they decked it out with supererogatory daubs of pretty and bewitching colour, and they set it round with a beautiful gold frame, surmounted with a crown of gilded bays, and something which is intended for a halo. Of the shadows and dubious blacks and browns which Wilde himself prepared by his life and by his lucubrations in jail, they have been anxious to take no notice. They were only brought out of their seclusion as weapons wherewith I might be defeated. The pot of blackness was brought into a court of justice, and there emptied before the gaze of all beholders, as was supposed, for my upsetting. Then the mess was all scraped up, as best it could be, and hurried back to the British Museum, and, honour being now satisfied and all being over, everybody, it was hoped, would speedily forget the little black pot. But not so. It will never be forgotten, and must always be remembered by anybody who wishes to look honestly at the features of Wilde. So far as I am concerned, I have drawn my own picture from the man as I knew him, and from his writings, which are readily accessible, and can be pursued by all who care to take the trouble. If I had been disposed to write the present book in the vein of De Profundis, published or unpublished, it would not have been difficult, from a literary point of view, for me to do so. I could have embellished my pages with tears and regrets and moral reflections, not to say with quotations from the classics and Holy Scripture, just as readily and at just as great length as Wilde has done. Surely if any man has had cause for tears and bitter regrets, I have had cause. All my life, from 20 years of age up, has been overshadowed and filled with scandal and grief through my association with this man, Oscar Wilde. I am not going to shed public or private tears about it, and I am not going to waste my breath in vain regrets. I have absolutely an easy conscience as regards my treatment of Wilde, both before and since his death. If I have hurt anybody at all, it has been myself and my family, and I have done this only through misplaced loyalty to my friend and a too high regard for chivalry. I now say all that I have had to say about Wilde, whether with respect to my personal relationship to him or my mature view of his complete writings. It will be noted that, just as I have refrained from weeping and moralizing, I have equally refrained from details of petty quarrels and misunderstandings. I have not accused him of gobbling my food, and spilling my wine, and devouring my substance. I have not charged him, as I easily might, with corrupting my intellect, and assisting me in the careless waste of some of the best years of my life. I have never said, as he says of me, that I became a child in his hands, and that we never met, except in the gutter, and never conversed except about loathsome things. I hold that a man's acts are his own affairs, even if they lead to his ruin and disgrace. The shifting of responsibility is no work for me or any other person of sense. I accept full responsibility for everything I have done or said in regard to this affair. For my own indiscretions and carelessness, I could not honestly blame anybody. I have been punished for them, and shall doubtless go on being punished for them. But there they are, and all the water in the sea will not wash them out. This book is not an apology for me, neither is it a work undertaken on the tu quoque, or tit-for-tat principle, against Wilde. I am of opinion that, in the circumstances, there is no man living who can put Oscar Wilde into his true relation to the life and literature of his time more accurately than myself. I have always known this, though at the same time I have hitherto refrained from putting my pen to paper. My enemies have compelled me to defend myself, and if, in the course of that defence, I have had to tear away some of the undeserved laurels which have been heaped upon his brow, and dissipated some of the undeserved incense which has been offered up at his shrine, I have done him no wrong. And I feel that I may conceivably have made a slight contribution to the literary and general good. It seems to me a great deal more than probable that the present volume will rouse a considerable deal of what is called controversy. The right of criticism is everybody's right, and I shall not hope to be spared criticism, or, for that matter, even contradiction. I shall only beg that those reviewers whose duty and business it will be to deal with this book may remember that I am entitled to exactly as much justice in this world as Wilde and Wilde's friends. The forces against me are undoubtedly numerous and powerful. On the other hand, it is very certain that I shall not run away from them. End of chapter 28. End of Oscar Wilde and Myself by Lord Alfred Douglas. Recorded by Rob Marland.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and click on the bell to turn on notifications.